what is one of the most contested turning points in American history? Many would point to the Civil War, but what if the man who defined that war never stood at its center? What if the election of 1860 unraveled differently? Not just a different president, but a different America entirely. Picture a nation still echoing with Lincoln's warning, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." In this version, the fractures of 1860 don't heal, they widen. Driven by a razor-thin election and a chaotic four-way split, the answer to who fills Lincoln's absence leads us straight to the heart of a political crisis, one that begins before a single shot is fired. In 1860, the American political system reached a breaking point. The presidential contest wasn't a typical two-man race, it was a four-way standoff, a reflection of a nation already split at the seams. Abraham Lincoln, the Republican, won the White House with less than 40% of the popular vote. A minority president for a country that had lost its ability to agree on anything. The Democratic Party, which had dominated for decades, shattered at its Charleston Convention, unable to reconcile the North's and South's positions on slavery. They split into two factions, one backing Stephen A. Douglas, who championed letting territories vote on slavery themselves, popular sovereignty, and the other choosing John C. Breckinridge, who promised to defend slavery's expansion. Meanwhile, the Constitutional Union Party, led by John Bell, tried to ignore the crisis, focusing on preserving the Union above all else. The result was a map that looked less like a nation and more like a battleground. In the North, Lincoln and Douglas fought for every vote in the South. Breckinridge and Bell divided the spoils. Lincoln's name didn't even appear on the ballots in 10 southern states. He was invisible there, a candidate who could only win by sweeping the North. And he did, just barely. But the victory was fragile. If any of the northern swing states, like New York, with its stockpile of electoral votes, had tipped against him, Lincoln would have fallen short of the majority needed in the Electoral College. The entire presidency would hang in the balance, not on the will of the people, but on the razor's edge of a few states' decisions. The Constitution had a mechanism for this kind of deadlock, the contingent election. If no candidate claimed an electoral majority, the House of Representatives would decide. But the rules changed dramatically inside those marble halls. Each of the 33 states got one vote, regardless of size or population. The bustling cities of New York and the empty plains of Oregon counted the same. 17 state delegations were needed to claim the presidency. In 1860, the Republicans controlled 16, just one short. The Democrats held 13, and the remaining 4 or 5 were deadlocked or controlled by minor parties, unable to offer a clear vote for anyone. Suddenly, the outcome was no longer about the popular vote or even the electoral count. It was about alliances, deals, and desperation. The North's numerical strength evaporated. The balance of power shifted to the states themselves, each with equal weight. The Republicans, despite their momentum, found themselves trapped. They couldn't reach the majority. The Democrats, fractured but stubborn, also faced a wall. The House chamber became a pressure cooker, with the fate of the nation suspended in the air. Picture Washington in the winter of 1860. The Capitol is tense, the air thick with rumors and anxiety. Southern delegations threaten secession if Lincoln prevails. Northern leaders warn of chaos if a pro-slavery candidate is installed. The center cannot hold. The usual machinery of government grinds to a halt as congressmen gather in private rooms, bargaining for the future. The stakes are existential: the survival of the Union, the fate of slavery, the very meaning of democracy. John C. Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, is too extreme for most Northern delegations. Choosing him would be a provocation, a signal that the South has seized control. Lincoln, on the other hand, is equally unpalatable to the South. His election by House vote would be seen as a Northern coup, a declaration that compromise is dead. The chamber looks for a middle path, a figure who can hold the center, if only for a moment. That man is Stephen A. Douglas, known as the Little Giant. Douglas spent his career arguing that the people of each territory should decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. His Kansas-Nebraska Act meant to bridge the divide, only deepened it. But he remains the only candidate with a plausible claim to neutrality. He's not beloved by either extreme, but he's not hated enough to start a war. At least not immediately. The scramble to install Douglas would be frantic. To win over wavering delegations, he would have to offer something to everyone. To the South, he'd promised to respect their institutions and let them decide their own fate. To the border states, he'd pledge stability and moderation. To the North, he'd sell himself as the only alternative to Breckinridge's extremism and the only hope for avoiding outright civil war. He would become the candidate of uneasy compromise, the man who keeps the country together by refusing to take a stand. But this compromise is an illusion. Douglas's popular sovereignty had already failed to resolve the core conflict. It would only delay the inevitable. Electing him would not heal the country. It would freeze the crisis in place, buying time while the underlying tensions festered. The House, desperate to avoid immediate disaster, would choose Douglas, not because he inspired confidence, but because he represented a temporary escape from the abyss. The outcome would not be a triumph for democracy. It would be a warning. The system, when pushed to its limits, produces not a leader of vision, but a manager of decline. Douglas, forced into the presidency by backroom deals and shifting alliances, would inherit a nation more fractured than ever. His administration would be marked by paralysis, endless negotiation, and the slow erosion of faith in the Union itself. The election that broke America would not end with a bang, but with a long, painful unraveling. The Union would stumble forward, its divisions deepening, its institutions hollowed out by compromise. The cause of abolition, the promise of a new political movement, will be left stranded, its momentum lost, its future uncertain. And in the shadow of this failed victory, a new question emerges. What becomes of a political party when its first great chance slips away? What happens to a movement built on hope and defiance when the system refuses to let it win? The story of the Republican Party in 1860 is a study in fragile momentum. 6 years earlier, it hadn't existed. Its birth was a direct reaction to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a law engineered by Stephen Douglas that cracked open the door for slavery's westward expansion and shattered the uneasy peace of the Missouri Compromise. That single act set off a chain reaction. Former Whigs, their own party dissolved by indecision, joined with anti-slavery Democrats and radical abolitionists. These were people who had spent years in political exile, suddenly drawn together by a single urgent purpose: stop the spread of slavery, and in doing so, preserve the Union itself. The Republican platform in 1860 was simple but explosive. No more expansion of slavery into the territories. Around that core, the RAP policies meant to broaden their appeal: protective tariffs for northern manufacturers, promises of free land for settlers, and federal investment in infrastructure. But everyone knew what really held the party together. It was a coalition bound by a moral line in the sand, and that line ran straight through the heart of the country. A defeat in the House, however, is more than a lost election. It's a fracture that exposes every seam in the Republican coalition. The party's moderates, men like Abraham Lincoln and William Seward, had always tried to balance moral urgency with political calculation. They were willing to compromise, to move slowly, if it meant keeping the Union together. The Radicals, led by voices like Salmon P. Chase and Charles Sumner, had no patience for half measures. For them, containment was cowardice. Only immediate abolition would do. Without the unifying force of a presidential victory, these factions turn on each other. The Radicals blame the moderates for playing it safe, for focusing on continuing slavery rather than ending it outright. They say the loss is proof that compromise is a dead end. The moderates, in turn, accuse the Radicals of scaring off swing voters with their uncompromising rhetoric, making the party look like a band of extremists, and handing the presidency to Douglas. The argument isn't just about tactics, it's about the party's soul. And in the aftermath of defeat, nobody's interested in reconciliation. This kind of infighting isn't theoretical. American history is littered with third parties that flared up and then vanished as quickly as they arrived. The Know-Nothings had ridden a wave of anti-immigration sentiment to brief national prominence, only to dissolve into irrelevance when their coalition collapsed over slavery. The Republican Party, now denied its breakthrough, starts to follow that same path. The tent that once seemed big enough for everyone shrinks rapidly. The party retreats to its new strongholds in New England and the upper Midwest, its national ambitions dashed. The consequences are immediate and personal. William Seward, once the odds-on favorite to lead the party and the country, finds himself a senator without a movement. His grand vision for America dissolves into a string of frustrated speeches, his influence fading with each passing session. Salmon P. Chase, who had built his career on morale, clarity, and anti-slavery conviction, sees his future narrow to the confines of state politics. The networks, the alliances, the dreams of a new political order all begin to unravel. Political parties in this era run on more than ideals, they run on money. In 1860, the Republican Party had convinced northern industrialists, bankers, and merchants to back them, promising policies that would favor economic growth in the North. A presidential victory was supposed to deliver returns on those investments. When that victory slips away, so does the money. Donors lose faith in a dividend-defeated party. The machinery that powered the Republican rise, newspapers, pamphlets, campaign offices, grinds to a halt as funds dry up. What's left is a skeleton crew of diehards and volunteers, a movement running on fumes. Momentum once lost, it's nearly impossible to regain. The Republican Party doesn't implode overnight. It fades gradually, becoming just another regional voice unable to mount a serious challenge on the national stage. Its platform, free soil, free labor, free men, loses its force. The phrase that once electrified crowds becomes an echo, a memory of moment that might have changed everything. This collapse has a ripple effect far beyond policies. The abolitionist movement, which had finally found a political home, is left adrift without the Republicans as a national force. The campaign to end slavery loses its most powerful weapon in Washington. The Democratic Party, still riven by its own divisions, but now unopposed, resumes its dominance. The issue of slavery, unresolved and festering, continues to poison the country's policies. The machinery of government returns to business as usual. But the underlying crisis only deepens. The fate of the Republican Party becomes a warning. Movements built on hope and morale, urgency can change the world. But only if they survive their first test. Without victory, without power, even the most outrageous cause can be pushed to the margins. The party that once promised to reshape America instead becomes a cautionary tale, a ghost in the political graveyard. Remembered only by historians and those who still dream of what might have been. Yet the nation doesn't return to stability. The wound that brought the Republicans together in the first place remains open. The Democratic establishment, now unchecked, faces the same impossible questions about the future of slavery, the Union, and the meaning of freedom. The old order limps on, but the center is weaker than ever. The country is left searching for answers, with no clear voice to guide it. As the dust settles, the political stage is set for a new kind of uncertainty. The man now at the helm, Stephen Douglas, must try to govern a nation that has already began to come apart. The challenge he faces is not just about policy or compromise, it's about whether any leader in this moment can hold together a country that has lost its sense of direction. Stephen Douglas's promise was simple on its surface. Let the people decide. Popular sovereignty, his great invention, was supposed to drain the poison from America's politics by handing the question of slavery to the settlers themselves. It sounded democratic, pragmatic, almost noble, but it was a promise already broken by history. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, Douglas's signature achievement, had unleashed chaos instead of consensus. In the years since, the phrase "bleeding Kansas" had come to mean one thing, that when the stakes were existential, ballots turned into bullets and neighbors into enemies. This was a flawed tool Douglas brought to the presidency, convinced he could wield it to patch a nation already coming apart at the seams. March 4th, 1861. The Capitol dome is unfinished, scaffolding rising like the bones of a nation still under construction. Stephen A. Douglas stands before a divided crowd, hand on the Bible, inheriting a government in freefall. In the months since the election, while President Buchanan watched helplessly, the Union had begun to dissolve. South Carolina seceded first, then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed, each state peeling away with a mixture of defiance and dread. In Montgomery, a new Confederate government was already setting up shop. Douglas, the little giant, believed he could talk them back from the brink. He saw crisis as a negotiation, not a reckoning. Douglas's entire political life had been built on the idea that every conflict could be solved if everyone just sat down at the table. He was a master of compromise, a man who thrived in the smoke-filled rooms of Congress, hammering out deals that pleased no one but kept the wheels turning. But now, the wheels were coming off. The South no longer wanted a deal. For the leaders of secession, the time for compromise had ended the moment a president from outside their world took office. Douglas's faith in popular sovereignty, a policy that had already failed spectacularly in Kansas, offered nothing to men who saw their entire way of life under threat. For the Southern radicals, Douglas was not an ally. The Dred Scott decision handed down by the Supreme Court in 1857 had given them a legal argument. The federal government, they claimed, could not prevent them from taking enslaved people into any territory. Popular to sovereignty to them was an existential threat, a loophole Northerners could use to avoid slavery out of existence, one territory at a time. Douglas' offer of local choice was seen as a Trojan horse, a way to strangle slavery's expansion and eventually its survival. In the North, Douglas's promise was just as toxic, but for different reasons. Abolitionists and anti-slavery Republicans saw popular sovereignty as moral cowardice. To them, it was a way of pretending that the country could simply vote away its original sin, as if the fate of the millions could be settled by a show of hands. Douglas's refusal to take a stand, his insistence on process over principle, looked like a betrayal. The idea that the federal government could remain neutral on slavery, that it could leave the question to the shifting winds of local politics, was bad to everyone who believed in the promise of liberty. So Douglas entered office with no real base. The South viewed him as a threat, the North saw him as a sellout. His presidency began in a vacuum of trust, with every move scrutinized, every word parsed for signs of surrender or aggression. He faced a nation already divided into camps, each convinced that the other was about to destroy everything they held sacred. Desperate to find a way forward, Douglas would have turned to the last battered tools of compromise. The Crittenden Compromise, a package of constitutional amendments designed to appease the South, would have become his lifeline. Its core idea was simple: draw a new line across the continent, resurrecting the Missouri Compromise, and make slavery permanent and protected south of that line. It was a solution rooted in the past, an attempt to restore an old balance that no longer existed. But even this grand gesture was doomed. The South's new leaders were not interested in guarantees or lines on a map. They wanted independence, not reassurance. They were already building a new nation, one founded on the explicit protection of slavery and white supremacy. For them, Douglas's offer was too little too late. A sign of Northern weakness, not good faith. Every compromise proposal only deepened their conviction that the Union was finished, that the time for negotiation had passed. Meanwhile, in the North, the idea of writing slavery's expansion into the Constitution was unthinkable. The Republican Party, even in defeat, could not accept a deal that betrayed everything it stood for. The abolitionist press would have erupted in outrage. Political leaders would have denounced Douglas as a man willing to sacrifice principle for peace. The Crittenden Compromise, like so many last-minute bargains before it, would have died in committee, a casualty of irreconcilable demands. Douglas tried to govern through persuasion and patience. His inaugural address would have been a dry recitation of constitutional arguments and legal precedents. No poetry, no moral clarity, just a plea for time and negotiation. He would have promised to enforce the laws, to respect property rights, to seek common ground. But the moment demanded more than words. The South saw his moderation as weakness. The North saw his refusal to act as betrayal. The border states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, watched closely. These were the places where the fate of the Union would be decided. They needed signs of strength, of resolve. Instead, they saw a president caught between factions, paralyzed by the fear of provoking war, but unable to prevent it. Douglas's attempt to reassure both sides reassured no one. Federal authority began to dissolve, not with a dramatic confrontation, but through slow, quiet erosion. Laws went unenforced, federal property was abandoned or seized. The machinery of government sputtered as local loyalties replaced national ones. Douglas's presidency became a study in paralysis. Every effort to split the difference made things worse. His supporters dwindled, his critics multiplied. The crisis deepened, not with the sudden violence of a cannon shot, but with a steady, relentless drift towards dissolution, where Lincoln would have drawn a clear line, defining the conflict as a test of democracy itself. Douglas offered only process and delay. The result was confusion, frustration, and a growing sense that the center could not hold. The promise of popular sovereignty, once hailed as a solution, now looked like a trap. It left Douglas without the authority to act decisively, without the moral foundation to rally the nation, and without the political support to enforce his will. He was a president in name, but not in power. A man watching the country slip through his fingers, unable to stop the unraveling. What followed was not a moment of reckoning, but a slow-motion collapse. The federal government faded from the scene, replaced by local militias, ad hoc committees, and rival governments. The Union did not break with a single dramatic act. It simply ceased to function, its authority dissolving in the face of competing loyalties and rising violence. And as the nation stumbled into this new reality, the question shifted. If there was no Fort Sumter, no clear line in the sand, how would the conflict begin? In the absence of a decisive stand, what shape would the coming struggle take? We remember the Civil War's beginning as a single unmistakable flashpoint. Fort Sumter, April 1861, the thunder of Confederate guns shattering the dawn, the Union flag under fire. That moment gave Lincoln everything he needed. A moral line, a villain, a call to arms. But in a world shaped by President Stephen A. Douglas, the story never finds its spark. There's no bombardment, no rallying cry, no sudden shift from argument to war. Instead, the crisis steeps across the map, slow and corrosive, never quite erupting, never quite ending. The uncivil war begins not with an explosion, but with a long, uncertain silence. Douglas, ever the compromiser, would have seen the federal garrisons in the South as tinderboxes, not symbols. He would have ordered the evacuation of places like Fort Sumter, lowering the flag in hopes of buying time and goodwill. He'd call it statesmanship, a gesture meant to bring the seceding states back to the table. But by removing the tripwire, Douglas erases the moment that, in our history, forced every American to choose a side. Instead of a nation at war, the United States becomes a nation in limbo. Without a formal declaration, the fight moves out of the spotlight and into the shadows. The real struggle ignites in the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware. The lines are blurred, and loyalty is a question that splits families. These states, vital for their geography and resources, become the crucible of the conflict. There's no clear front, no massed armies, just a patchwork of local militias, vigilante gangs, and partisan bands. Violence erupts in back roads and courthouse squares. In Missouri, old rivalries from bleeding Kansas come roaring back. German immigrants and pro-Union farmers arm themselves against secessionist Minutemen. Rail bridges burn in the night. Sheriffs pick sides and jails become fortresses. The war is everywhere and nowhere. Neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. In this world, the federal government is a ghost. Douglas, trapped by his own faith in negotiation, can't name the crisis for what it is. He refuses to call it rebellion, threatening the violence as a series of local disturbances, not a national emergency. His response is bureaucratic, not military. He sends federal marshals into chaos, issues proclamations, begging for order, and convenes endless committees. In Washington, Congress debates while the country bleeds. Douglas's administration becomes a study in paralysis. Statements without action, law without hope, force without strategy. What's missing is the clarity that war can bring. Lincoln's Union had a purpose: preserve the nation, answer the gunfire at Sumter, restore the Constitution by force. Douglas's America has only one question. To a clerk in Boston or farmer in Ohio, the news from Missouri feels remote, tangled, and political. There's no sense of existential threat, no call that rings out across state lines. Why risk your life for a president who can't explain what's at stake? Why volunteer for a cause that feels like someone else's fight? The North, in its timeline, never finds its soul. There are no mass rallies, no surging lines of volunteers, no great speeches echoing across the fields. The abolitionist press shouts into the void, but the story never catches fire. The violence in the border states is relentless but fragmented. Skirmishes, assassinations, sabotage, and reprisals. Each act of brutality breeds another, but there's no single enemy to defeat, no capital to capture, no flag to reclaim. The federal government's absence turns every country into its own battlefield. Even courthouses in possible frontline. Meanwhile, the South consolidates without the threat of a Union invasion. The Confederate States of America has space to breathe. Their leaders build institutions, draft constitutions, and rise armies. Not for desperate defense, but for the slow work of nation building. The border between North and South hardens, not through conquest, but through agitation. The rivers and railroads of Kentucky and Missouri become lines of smuggling and sabotage. The borderlines fill with refugees, spies, and opportunists. The violence is a constant, but it never resolves. It just becomes a way of life. Douglas tries to revive compromise, resurrecting proposals like the Crittenden Compromise, offering constitutional guarantees for slavery below a certain line. But the time for deals is over. Southern leaders see these gestures as weakness, not reconciliation. Their new government isn't bargaining for better teams, it's claiming its own destiny. Douglas's overtures fall flat, and each failure deepens the sense of drift. The North grows cynical, the South grows confident, and the center cannot hold. The media landscape reflects the confusion. Newspapers in New York print stories of atrocities in Kentucky, but with no clear narrative. Is this a rebellion, a crime wave, or a new kind of war? Editorials demand action, but Congress delivers only debate. The national conversation fractures, each region consumed by its own fears and rumors. The old idea of the Union, one nation indivisible, fades into abstraction, replaced by a patchwork of loyalties and private armies. What emerges is a conflict without boundaries or resolution. The uncivil war drags on, year after year, a grinding, low-intensity insurgency. The violence never rises to the scale of a true civil war, but it never subsides. The United States becomes a country defined by its wounds, towns divided, economy shattered, families scattered. The border states, once the nation's hinge, become its open sore. For the South, the absence of a Northern crusade is a gift. The Confederacy has time to entrench its power, to build alliances, to imagine a future beyond mere survival. The longer the uncivil war grinds on, the more permanent the split becomes. The dream of reunion fades, and the old Union is no longer an idea to fight for, but a memory to mourn. And as the years pass, the world takes notice. The United States, once the rising force of the Western Hemisphere, now appears fractured and vulnerable. The vacuum left by a paralyzed government and a divided nation invites ambitions from beyond its borders. The struggle that began as an internal crisis begins to reshape the continent's balance of power, drawing new players into the game and setting the stage for ambitions far larger than anything the old Union ever imagined. The Confederacy's vision was never just about holding the line in defense. At its heart, and the movement for Southern independence was fueled by a hunger for empire, an empire built on cotton and on the backs of enslaved people. The blueprint for this new order was called the so-called Golden Circle, a plan to stretch the reach of slavery far beyond the borders of the 11 seceded states. Southern leaders pictured a future where their flag flew over Cuba, the Caribbean, and deep into Central America. In our timeline, the Union's relentless pressure crushed this fantasy before it could leave the drawing board. But in a fractured America, where the federal government hesitates and the North is paralyzed by indecision, the dream of the Golden Circle becomes something more than talk. It becomes policy. From the moment the Confederate States of America declared itself a nation, its leaders understood that survival depended on legitimacy. The world's greatest powers, Britain and France, held the keys. The South's diplomats worked every angle, but their real weapon wasn't rhetoric, it was cotton. The white fiber grown in endless rows from Texas to the Carolinas was the raw material of the Industrial Revolution. British mills in Manchester, French looms in Lyons. These engines of empire ran on Southern cotton. Without it, factories fell silent and workers took to the streets. The Confederacy knew it, and so did every cabinet minister in London and Paris. In our history, the Union blockade slowly strangled the South's economy, forcing Europe to seek new sources of cotton in Egypt and India. But here, President Douglas avoids escalation. He refuses to order a blockade, hoping to keep the peace and buy time for negotiation. The result is a steady flow of cotton across the Atlantic. Ships sail unimpeded from New Orleans and Charleston, their holds packed tight with the harvest. European factories keep running. The threat of economic crisis in Britain and France never materializes. King Cotton, diplomacy, a gamble in our world, becomes a devastatingly effective strategy in this one. Economic leverage quickly becomes political capital. In London, Parliament debates the American crisis, but the conversation is different. The anti-slavery movement is strong, but the reality of thousands of jobs on the line weighs heavier. Industrialists and merchants lobby hard for recognition of the Confederacy. The aristocracy, always wary of a strong, united America, sees a divided continent as a strategic boon. With the Union unable to project strength or unity, British leaders like Lord Palmerston see a clear path: recognize the Confederacy, secure the cotton supply, and weaken a rival. By 1862, after a string of Confederate successes in the chaotic border states, Britain makes its move. Diplomatic recognition is extended to the Confederate States of America. It's not a military alliance, at least not yet, but it's everything Richmond was hoping for. British banks open their vaults. Confederate diplomats sign contracts for rifles, artillery, and steamships. The South's credit, once shaky, suddenly looks solid. With London's blessing, France follows suit. Napoleon III, eager to expand his influence in the Americas, sees the Confederacy as a useful partner. His plans for intervention in Mexico, already underway in our history, now have a friendly neighbor to the north, not a hostile union. Legitimacy changes everything. The Confederacy is no longer a rogue rebellion, it's a nation recognized by Europe's greatest powers, flush with loans and modern weaponry. The focus in Richmond shifts from defense to ambition. The Golden Circle, once a whispered hope among fire eaters, becomes an official project. The government funds private expeditions, filibusters, aimed at destabilizing and eventually annexing nearby territories. Cuba is the first target. For decades, Southern politicians had dreamed of bringing the island into the slave system. Now, with European backing, Confederate agents funnel money and arms to pro-slavery factions on the island. They sponsor uprisings, hoping to create chaos that will justify intervention. The Spanish colonial government, already stretched thin, struggles to maintain order. Confederate ships patrol the waters, sometimes openly, sometimes under the cover of private enterprise. The same playbook unfolds along the Rio Grande. Northern Mexico, plagued by instability and weak central authority, becomes a magnet for Confederate adventurers. Filibustering expeditions across the border, sometimes claiming to restore order, sometimes simply seizing land. The promise is always the same: new territory for cotton, new markets for slaves, new states to tip the balance of power even further towards Richmond. All the while, the United States government watches helplessly. President Douglas issues protests, but his words carry little weight. The Union, riven with internal conflict and lacking the means to enforce its will, can do nothing to stop the South's expansion. The Monroe Doctrine, once a warning to European empires to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, becomes an empty phrase. With no unified American military threat, Britain and France operate freely. Britain treats the Confederacy as a client state, ensuring a steady flow of cotton and keeping the United States divided. France pursues its ambitions in Mexico, installing a puppet emperor and carving out a sphere of influence with no fear of American intervention. The result is a new world order. The Confederacy, propped up by European capital and protected by British and French diplomacy, becomes an aggressive, outward-looking power. Its leaders see themselves as the vanguard of a new slaveholding civilization. The expansionists fear that once drove the United States westward now drives us southward and eastward. Every new territory is another link in the chain of cotton and slavery. The impact ripples outward. The United States, humbled and weakened, loses its standing as the continent's dominant power. Its economy stagnates and policies fracture further, and its leaders look on as the South and Europe redraw the map of the Americas. The dream of a hemisphere free from old world interference is gone. In its place is a patchwork of rival empires, each jockeying for advantage, each willing to use the tools of war and diplomacy to secure its interests. For the Confederacy, the gamble pays off. The empire of cotton becomes a reality, its foundations built on forced labor and foreign recognition. The price is paid by millions. Enslaved people in the fields, workers in the mills, and the citizens of a United States that can no longer shape its own destiny. But beneath the surface, something else is lost. The driving engine of American progress, the relentless push for innovation, the explosive growth of the industry, the sense of shared national purpose, never ignites. The South's triumph comes at the cost of the North's momentum. The continent settles into a tense, uneasy equilibrium, each side wary, each side waiting. The world watches, but the great transformation that once defined America's rise remains out of reach. In this alternate America, the furnace never ignites. The age of iron and rust isn't forged by fire, it's shaped by absence, by everything that doesn't happen. The Civil War in our world was a crucible that transformed the United States from a patchwork of farms and small towns into an industrial colossus. But without the war, the spark that set the machinery of progress roaring to life never arrives. Instead, the nation drifts, its promise of modernity left to gather dust. The factories of the North, which in our timeline become the arsenal of democracy, never receive their orders for millions of rifles, cannons, uniforms, and rail cars. There's no urgent call from Washington, no bottomless government contracts to flood the workshops of New England and Pennsylvania with cash and demand. The partnership between federal power and private industry, so vital to the birth of the American Revolution, American industrial age, remains tentative and small scale. The gears of mass production turn, but slowly and always with hesitation. Companies expand in fits and starts, not in great leaps. The economic landscape is a patchwork of local industries, each growing at its own pace, none pulled together by the gravity of a national emergency. Railroads, too, missed their moment. In our history, the war made them essential. Armies had to be moved, supplies delivered, messages sent across vast distances in hours, not weeks. The Pacific Railway Act and the Homestead Act, both born of wartime necessity, become political afterthoughts in a country obsessed with holding itself together. The great iron ribbon that should have bound the continent remain unfinished. Their construction delayed by lack of funds, political will, and urgency. The West stays distant, less a partner in the national project and more of a collection of isolated outposts. The dream of a single unified market, goods flowing seamlessly from Chicago to San Francisco, remains just that, a dream. Innovation, that other children of conflict, loses its midwife. The Civil War's relentless demand for solutions, better rifles, more efficient supply chains, faster communication, created a golden age for American inventors and entrepreneurs. The system of interchangeable parts, perfected in the rush to arm the Union, becomes a curiosity, not a revolution. Medical advances spurred by battlefield necessity, new surgical techniques, better sanitation, organized field hospitals arrived decades late, if at all. The ironclad warships that changed the face of the naval warfare in the single afternoon at Hampton Roads remain blueprints and idle speculation. The national banking system born from the need to finance the war is still a patchwork of local banks and state currencies. Without crisis, the country muddles through, never forced to leap ahead. The titans of industry whose names would come to define the Gilded Age find themselves in a different world. Andrew Carnegie, in our timeline, built his fortune on the back of wartime steel contracts. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who made his railroads indispensable to the Union cause, never received the same windfall. J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, these men still exist, but their rise is slower, their empires smaller, their ambitions dampened by the lack of explosive opportunity. The great fortunes that in our world reshaped American society and politics are replaced by more modest successes. The Gilded Age becomes a muted echo, an age of iron that never quite gleams. Even the fabric of daily life feels the difference. Cities grow, but not with the same feverish pace. There are no waves of rural migrants drawn by the promise of factory jobs and urban opportunity. The countryside remains crowded, the pull of the city weaker, the shift from rural to urban America delayed by a generation or more. The westward migration that should have filled the prairies and mountains with new towns and new dreams is a trickle, not a flood. The country's population is scattered, its economic energy dispersed, its sense of national purpose dulled. Without the war's unifying force, the United States remains a nation of regions, not a single people. The North and West, lacking the economic and infrastructural ties that the war would have forged, drift apart. The South, now a separate nation, entirely casts a long shadow. The border between the two Americas is more than a line on a map. It's a chasm that divides economies, societies, and futures. The promise of American manifest destiny, the belief that the continent would be united from sea to shining sea, dies quietly, replaced by a permanent sense of fragmentation. There is no post-war boom, no surge of confidence, no sense of destiny fulfilled. The United States limps towards the end of the century, its progress slow and uneven. The world's great powers, Britain, Germany, France, race ahead. Their factories roar, their cities swell, their armies modernize. America, once poised to join them at the forefront of history, watches from the sidelines. The opportunity to become the world's industrial powerhouse slips away, replaced by a quiet, persistent sense of what might have been. The financial system, too, bears the scars of inaction. In our world, the war forced the creation of a national currency and a unified banking system. In this timeline, bankers and merchants struggle with a jumble of state notes, local currencies, and unreliable credit. Investment is riskier, growth is slower, and the American economy remains vulnerable to panics and crashes that could have been avoided with stronger institutions. The tools needed to build a modern nation are present, but unused. By the late 1860s, the cracks in the American project are impossible to ignore. The country is poorer, less innovative, and less connected than it should have been. Its cities are smaller, its industries weaker, its influence on the world stage diminished. The story of American progress becomes a story of missed chances and the slow decay. The energy that should have helped leap into the modern age dispenses, leaving behind a nation still defined by its divisions. As the decade draws to a close, the United States stands at a crossroads, not of triumph, but of uncertainty. The great leap forward never materializes. Instead, the country settles into a pattern of quiet rivalry, uneasy coexistence, and lingering resentment. The border with the Confederacy hardens not just as a political boundary, but as a symbol of everything left unfinished. And so, as the calendar turns to 1870, America finds itself changed, not by the fires of a war, but by the slow corrosion of missed opportunity. The nation is still searching for its identity, still haunted by the shadow of what it might have become. The next chapter isn't one of healing or reunion. It's a portrait of two Americas, staring at each other across a hostile divide, each shaped by the choices and the silences of the years just past. By 1870, the map of North America tells a story of fracture. Two nations, one calling itself the United States and the other calling it the Confederate States, stand on either side of a border that's more than a line. It's a barricade, a symbol, a daily reality. There's no post-war optimism, no grand experiment in national healing. Instead, the continent is locked in a tense, unresolved standoff that has become routine. This is the era of two Americas, each shaped by its own logic, each shadowed by the failures of the last decade. Start with the United States. The country that once imagined itself as a beacon for the world now feels diminished, both in territory and in spirit. It has lost much of its richest farmland and a large share of its population to the Confederacy. Washington, D.C. remains the capital, but the city's energy is muted, its halls echoing with the sound of arguments that never end. The government is weak, its legitimacy constantly in question. Presidents come and go, their names quickly forgotten, their policies more about managing decline than inspiring hope. Political life is a battleground of blame and regret. The Republican Party, which had once stood for a bold vision of free soil and free men, is now a regional voice dismissed as a party that failed to stop the split. The Democrats control the majority of government, but their coalition is fractured, riven by old wounds and new grudges. Factionalism is the rule. The country's leaders argue endlessly over the fate of the Western territories, but the debate has shifted. It's not about slavery's expansion anymore. It's about survival, about holding on to what little remains and keeping the Confederacy from swallowing the rest. Economically, the United States limps forward. The industrial engine that in another timeline would have powered the North to global prominence is sputtering. Wartime demand never came. Railroads are built, but slowly, and the great wave of urbanization is a trickle. Factories operate below capacity. The Homestead Act is a shadow of what it could have been, as settlers hesitate to move west, uncertain which flag will claim their land in 5 years' time. The West is a chessboard, every territory a potential flashpoint, every negotiation a test of resolve. The American spirit, once defined by restless ambition, now feels trapped, boxed in by borders and by memory, by the weight of what might have been. Look south, and the view changes sharply. The Confederate States of America, forged in defiance, has become the world's most unapologetic slave society. Its leaders are drawn from the old planter, men who see themselves as the inheritors of a noble tradition. Their vision for the South is not just survival, but dominance. A society built on hierarchy, discipline, and the iron logic of the plantation. The Confederacy boasts a large professional army. Its borders is lined with forts, patrols, and checkpoints, an armed wall designed to keep its people in and its enemies out. The CSA has achieved what its founders dreamed: international recognition. British and French diplomats attend balls in Richmond, and Southern cotton flows freely to European mills. But the price is clear. The Confederacy is a client state, its economy tied to the whims of foreign markets. Industrial development is discouraged. The railroads and telegraphs serve the plantations, not the people. The cities are small, the ports busy, the countryside ruled by a handful of families who control everything from politics to the courts. Below them, an enormous population of enslaved people toils in the fields, their lives measured in profits and loss. Beneath the surface, the Confederacy is a fortress under siege. The threat of slave rebellion is constant. The army is as much as an internal police force as a defender of frontier. Laws are harsh, punishment swift, and surveillance is everywhere. The culture is one of pride and paranoia. Martial values, rigid etiquette, and a deep-seated fear of change. The South's leaders look north with contempt, seeing the United States as a failed experiment in mob rule. They see themselves as the true heirs of the American Revolution, defenders of a way of life that the rest of the world is too weak to understand. The border between these two nations is a study in tension. It runs from the Atlantic to the Western Plains, marked by forts, river patrols, and barbed wire. Soldiers on both sides watch each order through binoculars, waiting for the next incident. Crossing the border legally is rare and difficult. Smuggling and espionage are routine. The frontier towns are filled with rumors, spies, and the constant fear that today's skirmish could become tomorrow's war. Nowhere is this tension more explosive than in the struggle over human freedom. In this divided America, the escape of enslaved people from the Confederacy to the United States is not just a moral issue, it's an international crisis. The Underground Railroad has evolved into a vast clandestine network that stretches from the Deep South to safe houses in Ohio and Illinois. Every successful escape triggers a diplomatic standoff. Confederate agents cross the border in pursuit, sometimes with official sanction, sometimes in secret. When they're caught, both governments issue furious protests. The fate of each fugitive becomes a test of national will. A single gunshot on the wrong side of the river could ignite a border conflict. The border is not just a line, it's a fault, trembling with the pressure of unresolved history. This standoff shapes every aspect of life in both countries. In the United States, the presence of a slave-holding superpower to the South shapes policies, culture, and foreign policy.
Anti-slavery activists are marginalized but persistent. Their cause now a matter of international law and border security. In the Confederacy, the constant threat of escape and insurrection justifies ever harsher laws and deeper surveillance. The two nations are locked in a Cold War, each side convinced that the other threatens its very existence. The competition spills into the West, where both nations fight for influence over new territories. Settlers, politicians, and soldiers are all drawn into a game of intrigue and intimidation. Each side funds local militias, sponsors newspapers, and tries to sway elections. The dream of manifest destiny, the old idea of a continent united by freedom and progress, is dead. In its place is a permanent rivalry, a struggle for advantage that never ends. Internationally, the consequences are profound. The Confederacy's alignment with Europe shifts the balance of power in the hemisphere. The United States, smaller and less confident, finds its influence shrinking. The two Americas become objects of foreign manipulation, their destinies shaped by as much by London and Paris as by their own capitals. The old idea of American exceptionalism is gone, replaced by a new reality, a continent divided, its promise unfulfilled. By 1870, there is no reconstruction, no attempt at reconciliation. The division is not temporary, it is the new normal. Each nation builds its identity in opposition to the other. The United States clings to the language of liberty, but struggles to live up to it. The Confederacy celebrates hierarchy and tradition, even as it feels the future. Both societies are haunted by what they have lost, and by what they might still lose. Yet beneath the surface, deeper questions linger. What does it mean to be a nation when the very idea of union has failed? How do you govern when every decision is shadowed by the threat of collapse? The answers to these questions will shape the next era, as both Americas search for stability in a world where the rules no longer apply. If you want to understand how American democracy lost its edge, you have to start with the office that was supposed to hold the nation together, the presidency, an institution that in our timeline became the engine of national power, never finds its moment in the sun. The faded blueprint of democracy is written in what the president cannot do, not what he can. Abraham Lincoln's real-world presidency was a break with everything that came before. He saw the Union as an idea worth saving at any cost. When the country fractured, he didn't wait for permission. He suspended habeas corpus, letting the army imprison suspected traitors without trial. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation as a war measure, an act of will, not a consensus. He created the first income tax, reaching directly into citizens' pockets to fund the fight. Each move was a gamble, a stretch of executive power that made his critics howl about tyranny. But Lincoln saw the presidency as the last firewall against collapse. He broke the rules, and in doing so, he rewrote them. In the world where Lincoln never rises, the presidency stays small. The man in the White House, Douglas or anyone like him, believes in process, not power. When faced with sabotage and sedation, he looks to the courts, not the Constitutional's war powers. He waits for Congress to act, even when Congress is paralyzed. The old legal guard, men like Chief Justice Taney, are ready to swat down any hint of execute or overreach in our timeline. Simply ignore Taney's ruling. In ex parte Merriman, in this one, the president backs down. The machinery of government grinds to a halt, and the states wash Washington with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. The Emancipation Proclamation, that thunderbolt from the executive branch, never flashes across the sky. Douglas sees slavery as a political headache, not a moral crisis. He won't risk the border states, won't provoke the South, won't wield the presidency as a weapon of transformation. There's no war measure, no sweeping declaration of freedom. The power to change history sits unused, locked in the president's desk drawer. Congress split and bitter. never acts. The presidency shrinks into a clerk's office, waiting for instructions that never come. The difference is more than style. It's a reversion to the founder's original sketch. The presidency is administrative, not visionary. The occupant is a caretaker, not a commander. The idea of a leader who can seize the moment, who can bend the nation's will in a crisis, fades into myth. The imperial presidency, so often feared in our world, is unimaginable here. The president is submersed to Congress, respected but powerless. The buck never really stops in the Oval Office. It gets passed and passed and passed again, until it's lost. This new order shapes the entire political ecosystem. The doctrine of states' rights, once a rallying cry and then a defeated idea, becomes a law of the land. The Civil War in our timeline was a brutal refutation of that philosophy. The victory of the Union proved that the federal government could and would enforce national unity. But in this alternate history, the lesson is the opposite. The federal government's failure is a warning, not a promise. States guard their autonomy with jealousy. Every federal action is met with suspicion. Every regulation is challenged. Every tax is a fight. The balance of power tips hard away from Washington, never to return. The consequences ripple outward. The federal government now sees as a meddler and a threat, loses the authority to tackle big problems. Picture a financial panic, a drought, a wave of immigration, any crisis that crosses state lines. The president can call for action, but he can't command it. There's no precedent for bold moves, no tradition for national mobilization. Each state acts in its own interest, and the federal response is a patchwork of half measures. The idea of a unified response of a president rallying the country is a fantasy. The real test comes with the crisis of the coming century. In our world, Franklin Roosevelt met the Great Depression with a flurry of executive orders and sweeping programs. The New Deal, a revolution in America, governs. In the faded Brooklyn, there's no such leap. The president lacks both the power and the example. He asks Congress for help, and Congress bickers. The states squabble over who should pay. Unemployment soars, banks fail, and the country drifts. There's no Social Security, no Work Progress Administration, no alphabet soup of agencies. The pain lasts longer, the recovery comes slower, if it comes at all. War. 2 reveals the cracks. In 1917, Woodrow Wilson led a reluctant nation into World War I, mobilizing industry, drafting millions, and projecting American power across the Atlantic. But in this timeline, the presidency is too weak to muster such force. The declaration of war, the draft, the nationalization of railroads, each step is a constitutional minefield. The president pleads, but the states hold the cards. Mobilization is slow, fragmented, and riddled with infighting. The United States, fractured and hesitant, is no one's arsenal of democracy. Even the idea of American democracy, its promise, its myth, begins to erode. Without a strong national government, the country can't guarantee rights, can't enforce equality, can't adapt to new challenges. The 14th Amendment in our world established birthright citizenship and equal protection. In the alternate timeline, such sweeping national committees are unthinkable. States decide who belongs and who doesn't. Civil rights becomes a local affair, subject to the whims of the states, legislatures, and local courts. The promise of a government, a people, by the people, for the people, is narrowed, fenced in by borders that should have faded, but instead grow sharper. The presidency, stripped of its muscle, becomes a symbol of missed opportunity. The office is long on ceremony, but short on substance. The world looks to Washington and sees not a leader, but a committee chairman waiting for consensus that never comes. The blueprint for modern governance, drawn in crisis, tested in fire, remains unfinished. The American experiment limps forward, still nominally a democracy, but one that lacks the tools to meet the moment. This isn't just a matter of constitutional design, it's a question of national character. the absence of strong executive leadership seeps into the culture. Americans grow wary of ambition, suspicious of national projects, skeptical of anyone who claims to speak for the country as a whole. The dream of a shining city on a hill dims, replaced by a patchwork of local loyalties and private interests. The idea that America could act decisively, boldly, together becomes a story for another place, another people, another time. As the 20th century approaches, the faded blueprint leaves its mark everywhere. The United States, once posed to lead, finds itself unable to rise above its own divisions. The presidency designed to be the engine of action in a crisis is now a relic, respected, perhaps, but never feared, never admired. The world changes, but the American system stands still, trapped by the limits it never dared to break. And so, as the century turns, the question isn't just what America will do, but whether it can do anything at all. The nation faces a world growing more complex, more dangerous, and more interconnected. The blueprint is there, but the ink has faded. The time for boldness has passed, and the consequences of restraint are about to play out on a stage far larger than any one continent. By 1900, the world expects a giant. In our timeline, the United States fills that role, industrial restlessness and newly ambitious. The country's factories churn out steel and locomotives, its cities sprawl, its population surges past 75 million. The Spanish-American War is a statement. The U.S. can topple an old empire in months and claim islands from the Caribbean to the Pacific. The Panama Canal cuts a new artery through the hemisphere, reshaping trade and military strategy. Roosevelt's Great White Fleet circles the globe, white hulls gleaming in foreign harbors, signaling that a new power has arrived and intends to stay. But all of this rests on one fact: a single, unified nation with the will and means to act. In the world shaped by a lost election in 1860, that foundation never exists. The American century never dawns. Instead, North America wakes each day to the reality of two rivals, neither strong enough to dominate, both too proud to yield. The United States and the Confederate States are locked in a permanent standoff. Their energy is spent not on expansion or innovation, but on maintaining the uneasy status quo among a tense border. The continent's promise is squandered by rivalry. The rivalry is more than political. It's economic, cultural, and military draining, resources and attention. Each nation eyes the other with suspicion, fortifying borders, building armies, and pouring money into surveillance and counterintelligence. The borderlands, Missouri, Kentucky, Texas, become zones of constant anxiety, where skirmishes flare and disappear and where the wounds of the past never close. Neither side can afford to look outward for long. There's always the fear that the other might seize an advantage while their gaze is elsewhere. This inward focus comes at a cost. The world's great powers, Britain, France, Germany, see opportunity. They send diplomats to Washington and Richmond, playing the rivals against each other. Trade deals are offered, then withdrawn. Military advisors arrive, promising new weapons and tactics in exchange for influence. European investors pour money into Southern cotton and Northern railroads, always with strings attached. The old Monroe Doctrine, once a warning to the world, becomes a hollow phrase. European powers no longer fear American intervention in the hemisphere. They expect to shape it. The Confederacy in particular becomes a willing client. Its economy depends on cotton exports to Britain and France, and its leaders are eager for recognition and protection. In return, the CSA opens its ports and markets, allowing European interests to take root. The dream of a golden circle, a slave empire stretching through the Caribbean and into Latin America, becomes policy backed by European capital and naval power. Confederate filibusters set their sights on Cuba and Mexico, knowing that London and Paris will look the other way or even offer quiet support. Meanwhile, the United States, diminished but not defeated, clings to its industrial base and its old ideals. It tries to build alliances with Britain and France, hoping shared values will outweigh the continent's divisions, but its influence is limited. The US can offer loans and manufactured goods, but it cannot enforce its will. Its navy is respectable, but not dominant. Its diplomats are received politely, but never as equals. The vision of an America that shapes the world's future is replaced by the reality of a nation struggling to shape its own. As the 20th century unfolds, the pace of global exchange accelerates. Empires rise and fall, new technologies shrink distances and expand ambition, but the Americas remain fractured. The United States and the Confederacy are consumed by their own Cold War. Industrial growth is slow and uneven, disrupted by political instability and economic dependence on Europe. The great fortunes of the Gilded Age are smaller, their reach limited, the railroads are built, but the continent is not knit together. The West is a patchwork of contested territories and uncertain allegiances, a region where both nations compete for influence, but neither can secure it. The world's attention turns elsewhere. London, Berlin, and Paris set the agenda. Decisions about war and peace, trade, and technology are made in European capitals. The Americas are no longer the stage for bold experiments in democracy or industry. They are a backdrop, a source of raw materials and cheap labor, a place to be managed rather than feared. The leaders of the USA and CSA attend international conferences, but their voices are quiet. Their concerns are local, their ambitions constrained. The outbreak of World War I exposes the continent's weakness. In Europe, alliances snap into place, armies mobilize, the world braces for catastrophe. But in North America, the question is not when America will intervene, but how the fractured continent can be used. The United States, with its lingering ties to Britain and France, leans towards the Allies. The Confederacy, drawn by culture and commerce to Germany and Austria, Hungary finds itself pulled in the opposite direction. Each side becomes a pawn in a larger game. European powers encourage sabotage, espionage, and proxy conflicts across the border. Factories are bombed, railroads sabotaged, and partisan groups armed. The war comes home, not as a crusade for democracy, but as another chapter in the continent's endless rivalry. The impact is profound. The United States never becomes the arsenal of democracy. Its factories are not mobilized on a massive scale. Its soldiers do not cross the Atlantic in great convoys. The war drags on, its outcome shaped by European sacrifice and strategy, not by American intervention. The CSA, for all martial pride, is a junior partner, useful but never decisive. The Americas remain on the sidelines, their potential unrealized. The consequences ripple far beyond the war. The 20th century's defining struggles against fascism, communism, and colonialism play out without a unified American presence. There is no Marshall Plan, no NATO, no voice calling for a new world order. The space race is a contest between Europe and Russia. The United States and the Confederacy watch from afar, divided and diminished. The idea of an American exceptionalism never takes root. The world's imagination turns elsewhere. The absence of a giant leaves a vacuum. European empires linger longer, their influence unchallenged in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The global balance of power remains centered on the Old World, its rivalries and resentments shaping the fate of distant continents. The Americas are a cautionary tale, a land of promise undone by division. A region forever on the edge of greatness, but never able to seize it. And yet, history does not forget. The shadow of what might have been hangs over every decision, every missed opportunity. The world stage is set, but the great actor never appears. The lessons of this alternate century echo in the silence left behind, in the absence of a unifying force, in the quiet drift of nations that could have changed everything. If only they had found the will to do so. History doesn't echo with certainty, it reverberates with questions. The main topic here is the echo in the room. What lingers after a single decision, a single absence, changes everything? The alternate world we've just explored isn't just a curiosity, it's a warning, a reflection of how fragile the scaffolding of democracy truly is. The election of 1860, stripped of Lincoln, becomes less a crossroads and more a void, a silence where the future we know never finds its voice. We often read the past like a finished script, every event locked into place, every outcome inevitable, but the truth is more uncomfortable. The story of America was never predestined. The election that could have gone another way exposes just how thin the line was between union and dissolution, between progress and paralysis. A few thousand votes, a handful of choices made in back rooms and polling places could have swapped out the entire narrative reel. The echo left by a president who never was isn't just a missing chapter. It's a different book, entirely. One written in the shadows of doubt and hesitation. Trace the consequences. The rise of Stephen A. Douglas, the little giant of compromise, is no triumph. His victory is the product of a system already fraying, a reward for trying to keep peace by refusing to confront the storm. Douglas's presidency is defined not by boldness, but by a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. The South, hungry for separation, rejects his offers. The North, wary of conflict, settles for half measures. There's no clean break, no moment of reckoning. Instead, the country slides into a protracted, borderless conflict, a slow-motion unraveling that never allows for healing. From this chaos, the Confederacy steps into the world stage. Its legitimacy isn't won on battlefields, but in diplomatic saloons in the counting houses of Europe. Cotton flows across the Atlantic, and with it, recognition and loans, and the quiet approval of foreign powers eager to keep America divided. The United States, denied the crucible of total war, never forges the industrial engine that would have powered its rise. The presidency, modeled on Douglas's cautious approach, remains a weak administrative post. States' rights become the dominant creed, and the center of gravity in American politics shift permanently away from Washington. The country grows poorer, its ambitions narrower, its sense of purpose diluted by endless negotiation. By the dawn of the 20th century, the echo in the room is deafening. The United States is no longer a rising power. It is a fractured, inward-looking nation, its destiny dictated by the ambitions of others. The continent is carved up, not just by geography, but by ideology and foreign influence. The world's great powers treat North America as a chessboard, moving pieces with impunity. The American experiment, once a beacon, becomes a cautionary tale. But the lesson isn't about the singular greatness of Abraham Lincoln. His story is extraordinary, but to focus only on the man is to miss the deeper, more unsettling truth. The real echo is the vulnerability of the very ideas he was forced to embody. Union, liberty, equality. In 1860, those weren't settled facts. They were radical, contested, and for many dangerous. The notion that the Union was perpetual was a minority view, one challenged by powerful voices who saw the nation as a fragile pact, easily broken. Universal liberty was not a consensus, even in the North. Many saw it as expendable if it meant avoiding war. Human equality for most Americans was a distant, even threatening ideal. These principles weren't stitched into the fabric of the country by tradition or habit. They were held together by the thinnest of threads, tested for the first time in a crisis that demanded more than just clever politics. In that moment, the ideas themselves were too weak to stand alone. They needed a champion. They needed a leader who recognized that the stakes were not just political, but existential. Abraham Lincoln's real genius was not in his rhetoric, but in his willingness to act when action meant risk. He was prepared to be hated, to be called a tyrant, to set aside cherished norms if that was what the moment required. When he suspended habeas corpus, he did so knowing it would be controversial, but believing that the preservation of the government outweighed temporary violations of legal tradition. When he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he reframed the war as a fight for something greater than territory, a fight for human dignity. He was not just managing a crisis, he was redefining what the country could be. The alternate timeline shaped by Douglass and his contemporaries is what happens when a nation responds to existential threat with ordinary politics. They were not villains, they were men of the moment, trained to believe that every crisis could be negotiated, every danger postponed. They offered compromise as a cure for conflict, hoping that the right words, the right deals would soothe the wounds tearing the country apart. But in doing so, they mistook the nature of the disease. The crisis was not about policy, it was about principle. They prescribed painkillers for a cancer that could only be cut out by force. Their path felt safer in the short term, but it mortgaged the future. The cost was not just delay, but decay. The echo in the room is the realization that democracy's survival depends on more than institutions and laws. Constitutions are only as strong as the leaders willing to defend them. Courts and elections are only as meaningful as the courage of those who uphold the spirit, not just their letter. The absence of Lincoln in 1860 is a case study in how quickly those supports can collapse. The nation faced with the abyss chose not to confront it, but to look away. The result was not compromise, but collapse. A slow erosion of ideals that left the country unrecognizable within a generation. Progress, as this alternate history makes clear, is never inevitable. It is always provisional, always a risk. It is earned, not given. The institutions Americans take for granted, strong executive leadership, national unity, the promise of equal rights, are not the default. They are the exception, the product of hard choices made at the edge of disaster. Without leaders willing to make those choices, the machinery of democracy grinds to a halt. The echo is not just a haunting absence, it is a warning. And as we look back at this pivotal moment, the question lingers. What if the next crisis finds us unprepared, unwilling to act, or too divided to choose? The echo in the room is not just about the past, it's a challenge for the present, a reminder that every generation stands on the same precipice, and that the future is shaped by those willing to confront the crisis, not just manage it. What comes next is not a return to certainty, but a reckoning with how close we always are to losing the things we think are permanent. When we close a book on this alternate America, what remains is not certainty, but the weight of choices made and unmade. The United States as we know it was shaped by a leader who refused to negotiate with catastrophe, who saw the nation's survival as a matter of principle, not just politics. Without that resolve, the very phrase United States becomes a contradiction, an idea left unfulfilled. Kelly Miller once wrote that it is enough to remember what Lincoln did, not what he might have done. In that spirit, consider what moments today might carry the same fragility. Share your thoughts below and subscribe for more alternate history.
The greatest tragedy of the American Civil War wasn't just the hundreds of thousands of lives lost. The real tragedy might have been if both sides had agreed to peace. A negotiated settlement sounds merciful, a way to end the bloodletting, but the reality is it could create more unsettling than any battlefield. An uneasy truce that leaves slavery intact, inviting European powers to quietly leverage the South's cotton and, in time, consider diplomatic recognition. Picture this. Appomattox Courthouse, 1865. Lee's sword rests untouched. Grant's horse shifts in the dust outside. The war's end is not marked by a handshake, but by a silence that lingers, heavy and unresolved, as if history itself is holding its breath. The scene inside the McLaren farmhouse is tense, the air pressed flat by the weight of everything unspoken. This is not the dignified closure that history books sometimes paint. Instead, it's a room where two men, Lee and Grant, face each other not as symbols of a nation reuniting, but as representatives of two causes, both battered and weary. Historically, the two generals meet here, face to face, to negotiate the surrender of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. But imagine instead if Lincoln's cabinet in Washington and Davis's provisional government in Richmond had struck a formal truce, one crafted far from the battlefield, its language shaped by political necessity, rather than the immediate reality of war. In this alternate moment, Lee and Grant aren't discussing the practicalities of surrender. They're reviewing the articles of a ceasefire sent from their distant capitals, neither man having the authority to alter a single clause. There is no handshake. There's only a stiff exchange, a nod that feels more like a formality than a gesture of respect. The truce is inked under pressure, a document born of exhaustion and political calculation. For the North, it's a bitter admission. 4 years of bloodshed have failed to restore the Union. For the South, it's a fragile claim to nationalhood, a confederacy recognized only by its own battered signature. The silence that follows isn't relief. It's the uneasy quiet of a country split in two, a vacuum where something vital was meant to be. Outside, the armies simply stop. Soldiers who, just hours before, were locked in combat now stand in uncertain lines, staring across a new and invisible border. Their rifles, Springfields and Ironfields, lower in unison. Not in surrender, but in suspension. One man from Ohio, grim, still streaked across his face, glances at a boy from Georgia. They don't speak, they don't wave, they just stand. Futures suddenly untethered, as if waiting for someone to tell them what comes next. In a single moment, they are no longer countrymen, they are not victors or vanquished, just two kinds of strangers, paused on the edge of a new reality. The historical record tells us that Grant, on April 9, 1865, offered generous terms. Officers could keep their sidearms, mend their horses for spring planting, a gesture meant to foster dignity and healing. Here, though, the generosity is replaced by the hard lines of political settlement. The terms are precise, cold, borders drawn, prisoners exchanged according to international precedent, reparations calculated and itemized. Gone is a sense of reconciliation. In this place, a treaty that reads like cold commerce clauses on territory and tariffs, while the majority of Americans grapple with a deeper, unspoken rapture. The aftermath unfolds in slow motion. The camps, once alive with the noise of war, fall eerily quiet. Soldiers pack their belongings, their movements mechanical. The questions hang in the air. Where is the new border? Will my home be on the right side? The journey home is surreal, a procession of men in blue and gray walking side by side along roads that now cross from one country into another. For a few miles, they share water, maybe a word or two, but an invisible wall stands between them. At a crossroads, the Pennsylvanians turn north, the Virginians south. No farewells are spoken. They simply part, their paths splitting into separate, uncertain futures. Nothing about this feels like peace. It's as if the war has been paused, not ended. The rituals of surrender are hollowed out. Stacked arms are not a sign of closure, but a temporary measure. Parole slips aren't ticketed home to a unified nation. They're travel documents stamped with the seal of a foreign power. Grant's famous uniform, described in newspapers as muddy and unadorned, is just another detail lost in the paperwork. The handshake that history records as a symbol of reunion never happens. Its absence is a wound that refuses to close, a missing gesture that leaves both sides unmoored. Without that handshake, there is no catharsis, no moment of grace, only the relentless logic of a settlement that satisfies no one and honors nothing. The war's central question, whether the Union would endure, receives no answer, just a bureaucratic pause. The moral question of slavery, so central to the conflict, is left unresolved. The North, having abolished slavery within its new borders, can only watch as the South preserves it, enshrined now in law and custom. The silence at Appomattox is the sound of that question echoing into the future, a challenge deferred to generations yet unborn. The scene fades from the farmhouse parlor, but instead of a single memory there are now two. Lee mounts Traveler and rides away, not as a defeated general, but as the senior officer of a new and wary nation. Grant stands in the doorway, the burden of a fractured Union settling on his shoulders. They leave in opposite directions. the space between them growing wider with every step. What follows is a landscape changed not by the thunder of cannons, but by the quiet construction of division. The soldiers disperse, their uniforms blending into the countryside, but the lines drawn by politicians remain. The new border isn't just a line on a map, it's a fracture running through families, farms, and the very idea of what it means to be American. The truce has ended the fighting, but it has also begun something else. A slow, uneasy process of separation, where every road, every river, and every handshake, or lack thereof, becomes a reminder of what was lost. The question now isn't just who won or who lost, but how a nation can be divided and still claim to share a history. The answer lies not in the farmhouse at Appomattox, but in the lines that will soon be drawn across the continent. Lines that cut deeper than any wound from the war itself. In this alternate timeline, the familiar map of the United States becomes a study in uncertainty. The lines that once marked state boundaries now harden in an international frontier, one that slices through old loyalties and redraws the meaning of home. The new border isn't a single, clean cut. It's a patchwork shaped by rivers, where possible, by arbitrary latitude, where it's not. The Potomac and the Ohio become more than just waterways. They're the spine of a new divide. In the east, the question of Virginia's western counties is reopened. West Virginia, which split from its parent in 1863 to join the Union, now finds its fate tangled in negotiations. Some counties might remain with the USA, while others might be claimed by the Confederacy. Each decision a fresh source of tension. The border states, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, are carved up by compromise, geography, and the shifting fortunes of war, leaving families and towns caught in the middle. The first days after the treaty are chaos for those who live along the line. A farm that once sat comfortably in the heart of the country now straddles two nations. A father's fields are in the Confederacy, his daughter's school in the Union. Daily life becomes a negotiation. Which flag flies over the courthouse? Which currency pays the taxes? The legal confusion is immediate and relentless. Some towns wake up to find themselves under a new government. Their postmasters replaced, their newspapers suddenly suspect. The border is a wound that never heals. Treaties hurriedly drafted attempted to impose order. Joint commissions are formed to place custom posts at key crossings, a practice seen in other 19th century boundary settlements, now awkwardly adapted to the American heartland. Along the Ohio and Potomac, small wooden shacks rise where there were once only ferry docks and dusty roads. U.S. Marshals and Confederate Rangers eye each other across narrow rivers, their uniforms crisp or worn, their faces familiar but now marked by suspicion. The new rules are confusing, not just for those tasked with enforcing them, but for everyone whose life crosses the border. Every journey to market, every visit to a relative becomes an exercise in paperwork and patience. The border's impact isn't just bureaucratic, it's personal. St. Louis, a city rooted in Union loyalty, but tethered to Southern commerce, finds itself cut off from the Mississippi's southern flow. Goods pile up at docks awaiting inspection or bribes. Kentucky's neutrality crumbles. Its southern counties bristle with new fortifications. Its northern towns fill with refugees and opportunists. Smugglers thrive in the new gray zones, ferrying contraband cotton north and manufactured goods south. The riverbanks are alive with whispers of deals struck, of news traded, of people slipping quietly from one world to the other. And then there's the matter of news itself. The delay in communication becomes a source of chaos and opportunity. In our world, the news of emancipation reached Texas so late that June 19, 1865, Juneteenth, became a day of liberation long after the fact. In this divided America, the lag is weaponized. Newspapers on the Confederate side print stories that paint the Union as a failed experiment. Northern broadsheets warn of Southern tyranny and the dangers lurking just across the river. Sometimes the same event is reported two ways, or not even at all. In the confusion, rumors become currency. A family in Maryland hears that their kin in Virginia have been conscripted by the new government, but no letter arrives to confirm it. A merchant in Missouri learns that tariffs have changed only after his goods are seized at the border. For those who try to cross, the stakes are higher still. The border is porous, but dangerous. Enslaved men and women see the line as a path to freedom, but the journey is now a diplomatic incident waiting to happen. Every successful escape sparks a round of accusations, letters between Washington and Richmond, threats of reprisals, and the constant fear that one misstep could reignite open conflict. The old Underground Railroad routes become even more perilous. Every safe house now a potential flashpoint. The landscape itself changes. Along the border towns are reshaped by the demands of security and suspicion. New roads are built to skirt custom posts. Old ones fall into despair. School curricula split along national lines. In the North, children learn of a war fought to preserve the Union, a tragic defeat that must never be repeated. And in the South, the story is one of triumph, a second revolution, a birth of a new nation. Holidays diverge. The 4th of July in the Union is a somber affair tinged with loss. In the Confederacy, a new day of independence is celebrated, the date of the peace treaty marked with parades and speeches. The very idea of what it means to be American fractures into two, each side defining itself in opposition to the other. Commerce becomes a daily test of the new reality. Picture a market town on the Ohio River. One on the northern bank, U.S. dollars change hands and federal marshals patrol the streets. The news from Cincinnati is filled with warnings about Confederate plots. Cross the river by ferry and everything shifts. Confederate dollars bearing Jefferson Davis's likeness. Buy flour and cloth. The men in gray uniforms talk about rebuilding, about providing their place in the world. The local paper praises the Southern cause and rails against the decadence of the North. The same goods cost different amounts, taxed under different regimes. Even the air feels charged. The distance between the two banks far greater than the width of the river. The new border shapes not just trade, but identity. The shared past becomes a battleground. In the North, the Civil War is remembered as a bitter failure to preserve the Union, a warning against division. In the South, its founding myth, a story of resistance and self-determination. The word American no longer means the same thing on both sides of the line. Are you a U.S. American or a Confederate American? The distinction becomes a marker of loyalty, a question that lingers in every conversation and every introduction. For some, the division is a daily frustration. For others, it is a quiet source of pride or resentment. The handshake that never happened at Appomattox leaves a vacuum filled instead by the routines of border checks, the rituals of new holidays, the slow grinding work of building parallel societies. The continent is split not just by politics, but by the slow accumulation of difference. Laws, customs, even the way people talk about the past. Yet beneath the surface, the border remains tender. Any crisis, a trade dispute, a skirmish at customs post, a political assassination could tear open the fragile peace. The wound never fully closes. The two nations watch each other wary and unresolved, each wondering if the next spark will be the one that reignites the fire. And as the years pass, the division seeps into every layer of life. Some try to bridge the gap, merchants, families, or old friends, but the current always pulls them back to their own side. The camera pulls back, the line on the map now stark and undeniable. Two countries side by side, each carrying the memory of what was lost. And in the silence that follows, a different kind of question takes root, one that echoes in the halls of power, in schoolrooms, and in the quiet moments of ordinary people. What becomes of those who try to hold the nation together? And how will their stories be told in this new divided world? In the shadow of division, Lincoln's name moves quietly through the new American landscape. It doesn't ring out in triumph. Instead, it drifts, half legend, half warning, between the walls of classrooms and the low-lit corners of taverns. The Lincoln Memorial, if it rises at all, is not the grand marble temple that commands the mall in our world. Here, it stands smaller, somber, set back from the Potomac's edge. The stone is darker, the steps less worn. Where our world's monument proclaims unity and hope, this one bears a plaque that reads only, "In memory of the Union lost." A faded inscription below whispers of a fallen hope. Visitors come, but they do not gather in awe. They linger in quiet, reflective clusters, eyes fixed on a marble figure whose gaze seems to pass through the Capitol, searching for something that isn't coming back. The commemorations themselves feel different. In this timeline, when Lincoln's body is carried home, the processions are heavy with a sense of unfinished business. His coffin travels by train through northern cities, each stop a public mourning, but the crowds are subdued, the grief, complicated. In Chicago, a boy stands on a curb, hat pressed to his chest, while his father mutters about the peace that broke the country. Across the border, Confederate flags fly at half-mast for their own dead, not for Lincoln. The sight of Union bands playing dirges is met by the distant echo of Southern celebrations, or by silence. Two nations, side by side, mark the same movement with different rituals, a split screen of memory. The legend of Lincoln becomes tangled in this divided mourning. His story reshaped by the absence of a single unifying victory. It's likely Lincoln would still have faced Booth's bullet. His enemies were real and the bitterness ran deep. But in this world, his assassination does not sanctify a cause. The shot at Ford's Theater is not the birth of a martyr, but the tragic end of a presidency that failed to hold the center. The news spreads through the North, not as a rallying cry, but as a final devastating punctuation mark. In the South, the reaction is colder. Some see it as a grim justice, the end of a tyrant who tried to subdue them. In the capitals of Europe, diplomats mark his death with polite regret, noting the passing of a leader whose vision could not survive the realities of war and politics. His words preserved in pamphlets and newspapers take on a different tone. The Gettysburg Address, soaring spare and immortal in our timeline, lands with a heavier irony. A new birth of freedom rings hollow when across the river a nation built on slavery stands unbroken. The promise that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth, becomes a reminder of what was lost, not what was secured. His speeches are no longer the foundational stones of a renewed republic. They become instead the elegies of a broken ideal. Reading classrooms recited at memorials, but always with the knowledge that the world he dreamed of never came to be. In the North, Lincoln's legacy is complicated. He's mourned as Lincoln the Tragic, a man of vision and courage, but ultimately a leader who watched his country slip through his fingers. His face appears on currency, but the $5 bill is a quiet reminder of loss, not unity. The penny bears his profile, but it feels like a token from a different era, a daily echo of what the country used to be. Schoolchildren learn about his presidency as an ill-fated struggle, a desperate attempt to preserve the Union that ended in compromise and separation. Teachers describe the impossible choices he faced: endless war or divided peace, principle or survival. He's remembered for the burden he carried, not for the victory he could not deliver. In the South, now Lincoln is cast as the defeated adversary. He's the man who tried and failed to force the Confederacy back into the Union. His name is spoken with a mixture of relief and resentment. Some see his end as the final act of their own independence, a villain's downfall. In Richmond, his portrait is absent from public spaces, His words rarely quoted except as examples of northern arrogance. The textbooks here tell a different story. Lincoln as the architect of destruction, the outsider whose ambitions collapsed against the will of the Southern people. On the world stage, well, his judgment is clinical. European observers see Lincoln as a well-meaning but unsuccessful statesman, a leader whose ideals could not overcome the realities of his divided country. In London and Paris, his death is noted but not mourned. The American experiment, once a beacon, now stands as a cautionary tale, a republic fractured by its own contradictions. Its leader remembered not for triumph, but for the limits of his power. Then there is the Emancipation Proclamation. In our timeline, it was a turning point, a document that transformed the war from a fight for union into a fight for freedom. But even then, its power depended on the advance of Union armies. It freed enslaved people only in the rebelling states as territory was captured, not across the entire United States. In this alternate history, its impact is even more limited. The proclamation becomes a symbol of unfulfilled promise, a document that proclaims freedom while slavery remains legal just across a new border. Its words are studied in northern schools as a testament to high ideals, but also as a reminder of the boundaries of law and the compromises of politics. In the South, it is dismissed as an irrelevant threat, the act of a foreign president with no power over their land. The Lincoln Memorial, with its dark stone and subdued inscription, becomes a gathering place for those who remember what might have been. On certain anniversaries, small crowds assemble, laying wreaths beneath the statue. The air is heavy with a sense of absence. The capital city itself feels changed, no longer the heart of a continent-spanning republic, but a border town, its monuments looking inward. The silence here is not peace, but the echo of a dream deferred. Lincoln's legacy moves through this divided country as a whisper. In the North, it is a story of noble failure. In the South, a warning against overreach. In the wider world, a lesson in the fragility of ideals. His words linger not as rallying cries, but as questions unanswered, unresolved. And just beyond the city, the river marks the line where two worlds begin to watch each other. The capitals on either side of that border grow weary, their monuments casting long shadows across the water. The silence at Lincoln's Memorial is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new kind of tension, one that waits quietly, watching for what comes next. Just over 110 miles of rolling hills and muddy roads separate Washington, D.C. from Richmond, Virginia. On a map, it's a short stretch, an afternoon's journey by train, a hard day's ride on horseback. But in this divided America, the two capitals stand closer than comfort allows. Each city locked in each other's gaze across a border that never lets anyone forget what's at stake. Geography makes them neighbors, history makes them rivals. Washington, D.C. sits on the edge of uncertainty. Its grand avenues, planned by Elephant to radiate confidence, now doubles as a defensive corridor. The White House, the Capitol Dome, the marble columns, they all stand watchful. Less like monuments to a thriving republic and more like sentinels at the edge of a fault line. Every government building is built with an eye towards security. The city's mood is cautious, its ceremonies tinged with anxiety. The Potomac River, once a gentle boundary, now marks the edge of a nation's nerve. Border checkpoints rise at the water's edge, each one a reminder that the city's fate is tied to the actions of its closest adversary. From the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the southern bank is no longer a symbol of unity, it's the first glimpse of foreign soil. Richmond, by contrast, is a city reborn. The war's scars have been covered by new facades and fresh ambition. Where Washington's architecture clings to classical restraint, Richmond's public buildings reach for grandeur. The Confederate Capitol is expanded, columns multiplied, its great halls echoing with the confidence of a newly recognized nation. The design isn't just for show. It's a deliberate signal, a way to legitimize the Confederate experiment in the eyes of the world. This is how new states announce themselves. Marble, granite, and the scale of their own ambition. The city's atrocity hosts balls and candlelit halls, the air thick with talk of cotton prices and European trade. Richmond's power is performative, but it's real. The city's leaders want the world to see performance, not just survival. The two capitals develop in parallel, each a mirror and a provocation to the other. Washington's formal receptions are tense. Every conversation a negotiation, every gesture weighted for meaning. The U.S. Secretary of State shakes hands with the Confederate ambassador, but the smiles are thin. Across the river, Richmond's gatherings are louder, more assured. The city celebrates its independence with parades and state dinners, confident in its place on the world stage. The contrast is visible in every detail, the measured restraint of a Washington ceremonies, the over-display of Richmond's pageantry. Much of the tension seeps into the physical landscape. The Potomac is no longer just a river, but a fortified boundary. Small customs houses are armed with guards who watch the crossings. U.S. patrol boats idle in their current. Their presence is a daily reminder that peace is conditional. Bridges become checkpoints. Lines of travelers waiting for papers to be stamped, cargo to be inspected. On both sides, rumors swirl about spies, about defectors, about the next provocation that could tip the balance. For Washington's residents, the southern horizon is a source of constant unease. Richmond's for the northern skyline is a challenge, a reminder that old enemies are never far away. Espionage becomes routine. Each embassy is a nest of informants, each diplomat mission a theater of suspicion. The Confederate embassy in Washington sits just blocks from the White House, its windows shuttered, its staff under surveillance. In Richmond, the U.S. delegation operates in a climate of polite hostility. Every piece of news, every public announcement is dissected for hidden meanings. A new tariff in the north, a trade deal in the south. Each move is a signal, a test of resolve. The capitals are locked in silent contest, every decision scrutinized, every rumor amplified. This rivalry shapes the very fabric of daily life. Washington's government invests in industry, infrastructure, and intelligence, determined to prove the Union's resilience. Richmond, flush with cotton profits and eager for recognition, pours resources into grand public works and military parades. The city's elite walk with the confidence of victors, their fortunes tied to the global demand for southern exports. The economic models diverge. One city leans into industrial might, the other into the wealth of plantations and the labor of the enslaved. The split deepens with every year. The proximity of the two capitals, just over 100 miles, but worlds apart, keeps the wound open. Every morning, Washington wakes to the knowledge that its greatest rival is almost within sight. Every morning, Richmond's leaders toast their independence, knowing how close the enemy remains. The Potomac's slow current carries more than water. It carries a weight of unresolved history. The memory of a nation that split but never settled its debts. In this alternate timeline, the Cold War isn't fought across oceans, it's fought along roads that run from Washington to Richmond. In the halls of government, in the markets, in the back rooms of border towns, proxy conflicts flare in the West, in Mexico, in the Caribbean. As each capital seeks to expand its influence without risking open war, the rivalry is intimate, relentless, and inescapable. The cities themselves become symbols. Washington, with its classical facades and careful ceremonies, stands for a union that remembers what is lost. While Richmond, with its new monuments and political squares, proclaims a future built on its own terms. The difference is visible in stone and steel, in the way people walk the streets, in the music that drifts from open windows at night. Across the Potomac, the lights of the other capital are always visible on the horizon. For those who live in the shadow of the border, the division is not theoretical, it's daily reality. Children grow up learning two visions of history. Merchants calculate prices in two currencies. Diplomats wake each day to the possibility that today's slight could become tomorrow's crisis. And while the capitalist maneuver and posture, the true consequences of division ripple outward, the border is not just a line on a map, but a living, shifting presence. It shapes every decision, every relationship, every hope for what the continent might still become. The story of these two cities is just not about power, it's about spaces in between, the places where the border is felt most sharply, where every crossing is a risk and every silence is loaded. And as the capitals harden, the lines on the ground grow, more sensitive, ready to flare at the slightest touch. The Mason-Dixon line, once a surveyor's answer to colonial confusion, becomes something else entirely. In this fractured America, it's no longer a line on a map, it's a living nerve stretched thin across the heart of the continent. The war between armies may be over, but here, in the hush of the borderlands, another battle begins. It's fought in the shadows, in the rustle of leaves on the midnight crossing, in the quick glance over a shoulder as a lantern flickers in the distant window. The peace that ended open conflict has not brought the true quiet. Instead, it has transformed the border into a place where every footstep, every whisper could spark a crisis. Picture a cold night along the Ohio River. The moon hides behind clouds, and the only sounds are the water's slow current and the faint crunch of dead leaves. Someone moves carefully through the trees, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the opposite bank. For them, the river's more than a geographical boundary. It's the line between bondage and a chance at something like freedom. In this new world, that chance is never guaranteed. Every crossing is an act of defiance, every safe house a risk. What was once an underground network could have evolved into an international smuggling operation, challenging the treaty's fugitive slave clause. Before the war, the Underground Railroad was a network of citizens breaking their own country's laws. Now, it becomes an operation that tests the limits of international diplomacy. The old Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, already a source of national agony, would have been reborn as a clause embedded in the peace treaty itself, ratified in the 10 months after Andrew Johnson's proclamations declared the rebellion over in 1866. The Confederacy would see this clause as non-negotiable. The right to reclaim enslaved people who cross the border. The United States, bound by treaty but pulled by conscience, faces a crisis that refuses to fade. Three groups become the new actors in this quiet war. Confederate bounty hunters, now carrying the full authority of their government, move along the border with practiced skill. They know the trails, the river crossings, the places where the brush is just thick enough to hide a desperate family. For them, every successful capture is both a payday and a patriotic act. On the other side, abolitionist agents work in secret. They are no longer just idealists, they are now part of a covert resistance, experts in false papers, coded signals, and hidden compartments. Their safe houses become foreign embassies of hope. Between these two northern marshals operate in a space that is neither clear nor safe. They are charged with upholding the law, which now means cooperating with the Confederacy's demands. But the law itself is at odds with the values of the people they serve. Confederate bounty hunters and northern marshals would clash in border towns, turning every tavern into a stage of clandestine diplomacy and moral crisis. The tension is constant, the atmosphere thick with suspicion. For every marshal who quietly looks the other way, there is another who feels the pressure of federal duty. For every bounty hunter who crosses the river, there is an abolitionist agent ready to risk everything to send a coded warning. The law is shifting things, sometimes enforced, sometimes ignored, always contested. The United States, especially in the North, face a paradox it cannot escape. The abolitionist movement, which grew louder and more organized as the war dragged on, refuses to accept the compromise of the peace. Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, these cities become sanctuaries in spirit, if not always in law. Newspapers print stories of families torn apart, of children snatched back across the border, of communities rallying to protect their neighbors. State legislators passed laws to obstruct or nullify the Fugitive Slave Clause, daring the federal government to intervene. The crisis is not just between nations, it's within the Union itself, as local and state governments rebel against the demands of an uneasy peace. Diplomatic notes fly between Richmond and Washington. The Confederacy accuses the United States of harboring criminals, of violating the treaty, of undermining the very foundation of their relationship. The United States replies with legal arguments and moral outrage, but every escape, every act of defiance becomes another wedge driven between the two governments. The issue never fades. It festers, poisoning every attempt at normal diplomacy, every negotiation over trade or territory. On the ground, the conflict is personal. A Quaker farmer in southern Ohio hides a family in his barn. The fear in his eyes matched only by his resolve. He knows that if he's caught, the consequences will be severe. Imprisonment, ruin, the loss of everything he's built. Yet he acts because the alternative is unthinkable. Down the road, a Confederate patrol moves quietly, searching for signs of passage. They have the right under the treaty to pursue fugitives a set distance into U.S. territory. Their presence is a daily reminder that the border is not a wall, but a membrane, porous, dangerous, alive with threat. The border towns become places where the rules change with every shift in the wind. Some residents become informants, trading secrets for money or protection. Others join the resistance, risking everything for a cause that feels larger than themselves. The line between hero and criminal blurs with every new law, every new demand from the capitals. The landscape itself absorbs attention. Roads are watched and ferries are inspected, and the riverbanks are dotted with the remnants of the failed escapes. This is not a peace that heals. It's a peace that festers, a daily struggle where the core question of the war: can a nation be built on freedom coexist with a nation built on slavery? This remains unanswered. The Mason-Dixon line and the Ohio River become more than just boundaries. They are scars, visible reminders that the conflict never truly ended. Every successful crossing is a diplomatic incident. Every capture is a headline. The two nations remain locked in suspicion, unable to move forward, unable to let go of the past. The longer this quiet war drags on, the deeper the mistrust grows. Trade talks stall, joint projects collapse under the weight of mutual suspicion. Even the simplest negotiations, maybe a new ferry route, a postal agreement, are colored by the knowledge that just out of sight, another escape is being planned, another confrontation brewing. The border is a place of hushed warnings and silent prayers, a landscape where hope and fear live side by side. Night after night, the pattern repeats: the river, the woods, the hurried footsteps, a lantern in an upstairs window shining out into the dark. It's a small act, but it means everything. A signal, a promise, a refusal to accept the world as it is. The border does not just divide two nations, it divides two visions of what America could be. And while the line holds, the future waits, shaped not by the treaties and armies, but by those who risk everything in the quiet hours, believing that the story isn't finished yet. The West was never just empty land waiting for a flag. It was a prize, a providing ground. And in this divided America, it becomes a stage for a cold mythological contest. Manifest destiny fractures. Two nations, each convinced of their own right to the horizon, move west, not as a single tide, but as a rival currents, each determined to shape the land in their own image. Picture the Great Plains, grass stretching to the sky, broken only by the distant silhouettes of surveyor teams and railroad crews. In this alternate timeline, Southern rail lines could have extended steadily toward the Pacific, driven by Confederate policy and ambition. Each mile a track is a statement. the Confederacy intends to be more than a regional power, these lines don't just move cotton and tobacco, they carry a vision of the South that stretches from the Mississippi to the furthest reaches of California. Every new depot is a marker, a challenge to the United States, a promise that the contest for the West is only beginning. For the United States, the push west is no longer about fulfilling a singular destiny. It's about holding ground, securing what remains, and providing that the Union still matters. Homesettlers, miners, and small town merchants become the new front line. Their towns, hastily built, fiercely independent, dot the landscape in a patchwork of hope and anxiety. The U.S. Army builds new forts, not just to protect settlers, but to signal to the Confederacy that the West is not theirs for the taking. Confederate ambitions, meanwhile, expand with a deliberate logic. The Indian Territory, what might have become the state of Sequoia, stands in the crosshairs. The Confederacy eyes this land not just for its resources, but for the chance to cement its way of life deeper into the continent. Plantation owners dream of new fields, new fortunes, and new states carved from the prairies. The idea of purchasing Cuba from Spain simmers in Richmond, an echo of past schemes and a sign that the South's appetite for expansion is not limited to the mainland. The Caribbean, too. It becomes a chessboard, every sugar field and port a potential asset in the Confederacy's quest for legitimacy and power. Not every ambition is realized. While the notion of annexing Mexican states like Chihuahua and Sonora floats through some circles, it remains more fantasy than policy. The Confederate focus for now remains on territories closer to home. Indian Territory, New Mexico, Arizona, places where the plantation economy can take root and the Southern model can be replicated. The dream is clear, a contiguous slave-holding empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific with all the resources and prestige that would entail. The West becomes a land of parallel societies. Imagine two frontier towns, sometimes only a day's ride apart, each a microcosm of the nation's ideals. On the U.S. side, towns grow from homestead claims, plots of lands worked by families, governed by rough assemblies, their economies built on free labor and the promise of ownership. The law is communal. The risks are shared, and every barn raises a vote of confidence in the idea of a freer West. But across the border, the Confederate vision takes shape. Here, the town center is often a manor house surrounded by fields, worked not by independent farmers, but by enslaved laborers or hired hands bound to the plantation hierarchy. The economy is consolidated. The law is the landowner's word, and the rhythms of daily life echo the Old South. The Confederate push into New Mexico and Arizona brings it not just new crops, but new social orders, plantation-driven cattle herds, large-scale cotton operations, and the deliberate effort to transplant the Southern way of life into unfamiliar soil. The most iconic figure of the West, that's the cowboy, splinters under this pressure. In Union Territory, the wrangler is a free laborer, sometimes a Civil War veteran working cattle drives or staking his own claim. He owns his saddle, negotiates his wages, and moves with the restless optimism of someone who believes the land can be made his. In Confederate territory, the cattle herds are often managed by crews beholden to a single owner. Some are poor whites, some are Mexican, and some are black men, free or enslaved, whose labor is claimed by the plantation system. The skills are the same: riding, roping, surviving the loneliness of the range. But the meaning of their work is not. The cowboy is no longer a symbol of one nation's independence. He's a living contrast between two competing futures. Native nations, caught in the crossfire, are forced into a deadly diplomacy, playing two rival powers against each other for the chance to preserve what little land and autonomy remained. Treaties become a bargaining chip, alliances shift with every new railroad or fort, and the promise of a protection is always conditional, always temporary. The pressure is relentless, and the cost is measured in lost homelands and broken promises. This is not the gold rush chaos of our history. It is a slow grinding escalation. Every new settlement, every telegraph line, every ranch is a move in a drawn-out game. Tensions simmer, in water rights disputes, in skirmishes over grazing land, in the quiet threat of a flag planted where it wasn't the day before. The West becomes a front line not of armies, but of settlers and surveyors, each side waiting for the other to make a mistake. Conflict is never far away. A border raid, a disputed claim, a single shot fired in the wrong canyon could trigger a crisis that pulls back nations back into the open war. The peace that holds in the East is always at risk in the West, where the rules are looser and the stakes feel existential. The threat of escalation hangs on every negotiation, every handshake, every promise made in a dusty saloon or a government office. Over time, the map of the West transforms. Instead of a patchwork of states unified by a common purpose, it becomes a mosaic of rival claims and uneasy truces. Free territories press against slave states, and every line drawn is another source of friction. The dream of manifest destiny, one people, one nation, one continent, fades into a contest of wills. The frontier, once a symbol of boundlessness, opportunity, becomes a source of constant anxiety, a place where the future is always uncertain and the past is never truly settled. From above, the land tells its own story. The lights of Union towns cluster along one set of railroad tracks, while the glow of Confederate settlements spreads from the south and the east. Two visions, two colors, bleeding into the same dark canvas. The West is no longer a promise, it's a question, one that neither side can answer alone. Yet for all the maneuvering, the fate of the continent will not be decided by rails or ranches alone. The West is only one front in a larger struggle, as both nations look outward, searching for allies and legitimacy. The contest for recognition and the judgment of the old powers waits just beyond the horizon. Recognition is currency. For the Confederacy, it's the difference between being a rogue experiment and a permanent nation. In the years after the truce, while diplomats in Richmond draft letters and send envoys across the Atlantic, the real battle moves from battlefields to drawing rooms. European capitals become the new theater. London's clubs, Paris's salons, and corridors of Whitehall and the Croix d'Or. It's here, beneath the glitter of chandeliers and the hush of velvet curtains, that the fate of a continent is decided. Confederate agents, once dismissed as rebels, now arrive in formal attire with carefully worded credentials. Their southern accents are no longer a curiosity, they're a sign of a new reality. The war is over, the map has changed, and the world's oldest empires must decide whether to acknowledge it. During the conflict, Britain and France kept their distance, wary of the moral cost. But as the years pass and the division hardens, diplomatic realism begins to outweigh abolitionist rage. The world has seen this before. Countries that hold their noses and shake hands because the alternative is uncertainty. Well, the calculation in London and Paris is pragmatic. Southern cotton still fuels the mills of Manchester and Lyon. The Confederacy's economy, battered but still rich in raw materials, offers a tempting promise. A divided America means two weaker states, neither able to dominate the hemisphere, both open to influence. For the British, who remember the sting of lost colonies, this is a chance to reset the balance. For the French, it's an opportunity to expand their reach in the Caribbean and Mexico. The question of slavery remains a public embarrassment, but in the private language of diplomacy, profit and power speak louder. Recognition comes not in the heat of war, but in the cold aftermath, when the dust has settled and the world is ready to accept the new status quo. With that nod from the old world, the Confederacy transforms overnight. European banks, once cautious, now compete to offer loans. British and French investors pour money into southern ports and railroads. eager to rebuild the infrastructure shattered by the war. The ports of Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans become gateways for a flood of manufactured goods and machinery. The Confederate government, suddenly flush with credit, expands its army to rival its old foe, purchasing modern rifles, artillery, and warships. The blockade that once strangled the South dissolves into open trade. The CSA, once isolated, now stands on equal footing with its northern neighbor, at least in the eyes of the world. For the United States, the shock is profound. The same European powers that once watched the American experiment with fascination now treat it as just one player among many. The Monroe Doctrine, long the cornerstone of American foreign policy, is quietly set aside. British warships dock in Confederate harbors. French diplomats toast the new order in Richmond. In Washington, the mood shifts from defiance to anxiety. Every decision whether to build a new railroad, negotiate a treaty, or respond to a border dispute must account for the opinions of London and Paris. The sense of isolation is palpable. The United States, once the self-appointed guardian of the hemisphere, now finds itself flanked by rivals, its influence diluted. The psychological toll is heavy. In the halls of Congress, old dreams of manifest destiny give way to a defense posture. The rhetoric of unity is replaced by talk of survival and sovereignty. The optimism that powered westward expansion is replaced by a weary realism. The sense of American exceptionalism, so central to national identity, begins to erode. The country that once saw itself as a beacon now feels boxed in, forced to negotiate a world where its word no longer carries absolute weight. Meanwhile, Confederate ambitions stretch beyond their borders. Richmond might have sought to buy Cuba from Spain, echoing mid-19th century efforts to strengthen its sugar economy. The Caribbean becomes a chessboard with the Confederacy eager to plant its flag among the islands. The possibility of new treaties, new acquisitions, and new alliances shape every decision. The world watches as a slave-holding nation, once on the brink of collapse, sits at the table of nations, its legitimacy secured by ideals, but by the old world's willingness to do business. The consequences ripple far, far beyond the North America. The formal acceptance of the Confederacy by Britain and France prolongs the global legitimacy of slavery, undermining the momentum of abolitionist movements across Europe and the Americas. Campaigners for emancipation in London, Paris, and beyond find their cause weakened, their arguments undercut by the reality that profit has trumped principle. This message is clear. As long as an institution is profitable and recognized, its moral cost can be ignored. The new order reshapes alliances. The United States, spurned by its former partners, looks elsewhere for friends across the Atlantic. The newly unified German Empire emerges as a natural ally. Both nations share a common frustration with British and French dominance. Industrial cooperation follows as American know-how meets German ambition. What starts as a marriage of convenience deepens into strategic partnership, one that unsettles the balance of power in Europe and North America alike. The Confederacy, for its part, becomes a pillar of the British and French sphere. Trade agreements multiply, joint military exercises take place along the Gulf and the Caribbean. Southern officers study in Paris and London. British engineers advise on Confederate railroads and shipyards. The South's economy, once only tied to cotton, diversifies under European guidance. The CSA's leaders, eager to prove their modernity, invest in industry and infrastructure, hoping to match the North's output and secure their place among the world's powers. But beneath the surface, the cost of legitimacy lingers. The Confederacy's foundation, its commitment to slavery, remains unchanged. The world's recognition does not erase the moral stain, instead it spreads it, weaving it into the fabric of global commerce and diplomacy. The world accepts, but the tension never really disappears. Protests flare in London and Paris. Abolitionists refuse to let the issue die, and the debate shifts from the halls of government to the streets, from polite conversation to politic outcry. Yet as long as the CSA's flag flies over its embassy, the reality stands. Slavery, for now, is not an aberration, but a fact of international life. As embassies open, treaties are signed, and new maps are drawn, the division of the continent becomes permanent. The hope for reconciliation fades, replaced by the routines of rivalry. The United States and the Confederacy settle into their roles: neighbors, competitors, and increasingly proxies for the ambitions of powers far from their shores. The world's gaze turns elsewhere. Europe's own tensions simmer, alliances shift, and the old powers look for new ways to tip the balance in their favor. In North America, the border grows colder, the stakes higher, and the sense of unfinished business settles over both nations. History does not pause. The next storm is already gathering far across the Atlantic, but its thunder will reach the divided shores of America soon enough. By the early 20th century, the United States and the Confederate States have spent generations glaring at each other across a fortified border. The world's biggest war doesn't just arrive on their doorstep, it finds them already half-ready, already suspicious, already armed. The Great War, as it unfolds in this alternate timeline, isn't just a European firestorm, it's a match tossed into a room soaked in old grievances and fresh ambition. The familiar black and white images of 1914 German troops on the march, British soldiers in the trenches, are only half of the story. Shift the map, and the lines of conflict redraw themselves across North America. The alliances that have been simmering since the peace of 1865 now snap into place. The United States, alienated by Britain and France, finds its interest aligning with the German Empire. The reasons are practical: a shared industrial outlook, a common resentment of British dominance, and a deep well of German heritage in American cities. When Europe erupts, the U.S. stands with the Central Powers. On the other side, the Confederacy answers the call of its old patrons. Its economy has been rebuilt with British and French capital. European advisors train its officers, and its cotton feeds the looms of Manchester's line. When Britain and France go to war with Germany, the CSA joins the Entente, eager to prove itself as a legitimate player on the world stage. And suddenly, decades of tension between North and South are no longer just a domestic affair, they're a live front in a global struggle. If the CSA and the USA enter the Great War on opposite sides, their long-frozen conflict could erupt again, diverting American troops from Europe to defend their own borders. The Mason-Dixon line, once a symbol of uneasy peace, becomes a continental front line. The old rivalries about tariffs, territory, and the meaning of freedom are reignited, but now the stakes are even higher. This time the world is watching, and every move is amplified by the interest of distant empires. The logic of alliances makes the situation volatile. Britain and France, eager to secure their North American ally, send weapons, supplies, and military advisors to Richmond. The Confederacy, emboldened by European backing, mobilizes its conscripted armies along the border. The United States, forced to split its attention, must now defend its own territory while supporting its allies across the Atlantic. The industrial might of the North is no longer a decisive advantage. It's stretched thin by the demand of two-front war. In this scenario, the infamous Zimmermann telegram takes on a new, more plausible shape. Instead of a desperate German plea to Mexico, Berlin reaches out to Richmond. The promise is concrete: join the Central Powers, and the Confederacy will secure long-coveted Western territories. New Mexico, Arizona, perhaps even parts of California, should victory come. For the CSA, this isn't a distraction, it's an invitation to finish what was started in the 1860s, to expand westward under the legitimizing banner of global conflict. Well, the irony is sharp. The war that tears Europe apart now gives the old American rivalry a new and terrible energy. What historians might call, well, a Western front. Opens not a war with Mexico, but a continental replay of sectional hostilities. Armies dig trenches not just in Flanders, but in the fields of Kentucky, the forests of Missouri, the outskirts of Baltimore. Cities that once symbolized the promise of a reunited nation now brace for siege or occupation. The language of propaganda shifts. No longer is a call to defend democracy in distant France. Now it's about survival at home, about brother against brother, about the unfinished business of a divided continent. The scale of the conflict is staggering. The United States, with its factories and forges, can produce endless rifles, shells, and locomotives, but the Confederacy, hardened by decades of militarization and propped up by European industry, is no longer outmatched. Its armies are disciplined, its officers seasoned, its population unified by a narrative of resistance and honor. The fields of Virginia and Tennessee become killing grounds once more. But this time with modern artillery, machine guns, and the lessons of European warfare, the impact on the global balance is immediate. In our timeline, American entry into World War I tipped the scales, flooding the Western Front with fresh troops and material. Here, that force is locked in a brutal struggle at home. The Entente, deprived of American reinforcements, faces a much harder fight in Europe. The Central Powers, relieved of pressure, find new opportunities to press their advantage. The war drags on, bloodier and more uncertain, as the world's most industrialized continent tears itself apart from within. The economic consequences ripple outward. The United States, instead of booming through war production for Europe, is forced into austerity and rationing. The Confederacy flushes with foreign loans, becomes a conduit of European goods and influence, but pays for it with blood and sovereignty. The dream of manifest destiny is finally buried beneath the mud and wire of a war no one can win outright. In the towns and cities of North America, the war is personal. Families are split by allegiance, old wounds are reopened, and every casualty list is a reminder of how far the country has fallen from the promise of peace. The propaganda machines on both sides churn out posters and pamphlets, but the message is always the same. The real enemy is the neighbor across the border, not the distant powers who pull the strings. Picture a single image. Two posters side by side in a train station. One, a Union soldier stares out from beneath his helmet, the words "Defend the Republic," "Enlist today," printed in bold. On the other, a Confederate in gray holds a rifle, his gaze just as determined. Honor the South. Join the fight. The faces are young, the uniforms different, but the language is heartbreakingly familiar. The grandsons of Gettysburg now march to the orders of foreign capitals, fighting not for unity, but for the agendas of powers an ocean away. When the guns finally fall silent, the world that emerges is changed in ways no treaty can fix. The United States and the Confederacy are spent. Their populations scarred, their economies shattered. Europe, too, is exhausted, but the old order has shifted. The idea of a simple, two-sided world, democracy versus monarchy, freedom versus tyranny, no longer fits. The presence of a divided America, each half shaped by foreign alliances and bitter memory, ensures that the next chapter will be even more unpredictable. As the new lines are drawn, new rivalries take shape, and new ideologies rise, the world prepares for a future where power is never just a matter of two choices. The old contest between North and South has become something stranger, a permanent, unstable triangle where every move is shadowed by the mistakes and compromise of the past. The world changes when a third ideology enters the room. The Cold War, as we remember it, was a contest between two visions, one draped in stars and stripes and the other of red and revolution. But imagine a third flag, stitched from the fabric of a lost cause, unfurled by every summit and crisis. The three-player game begins. Picture this. The newsreels in Berlin in 1961, the wall rises, concrete and barbed wire dividing a city, a continent, an era. In this alternate timeline, the camera pans not just to America and Soviet officials, but to a Confederate envoy, impeccably dressed, watching with a gaze that betrays both calculation and distance. Every negotiation, every moment of breakship is now shattered by a third perspective. The United States defending liberal democracy, the Soviet Union advancing the cause of global communism, and the Confederate States of America built on a rigid racial hierarchy and aristocrat vision that neither side can fully stomach or ignore. The alliances never settle, The CSA's foreign policy is pragmatic, sometimes cynical. One year it leans toward Moscow, sharing intelligence, quietly undermining American influence in Africa or Southeast Asia. The next, it finds common cause with Washington, united by a mutual fear of communist expansion. The logic is always shifting. Economic interests, agricultural exports, and the need for international legitimacy drive every decision. The Old World's powers, Britain and France, hedge their bets, sometimes drawn by Southern cotton, sometimes repelled by the Confederacy's social order. The triangle is never equilateral. Every side is wary, every handshake is tentative, every promise provisional. The domino theory, once simple in its terror, becomes a tangle of competing fears. Proxy conflicts in the developing world become three-way struggles as each power vies for influence. A new government in the West Africa is courted by American aid, Soviet arms, and Confederate promises of order and tradition. In Latin America, leaders weigh their options, align with the North for investment, with the Soviets for revolution, or with the South for a different kind of stability. CSA's ideology, rooted in racial hierarchy, appeals to some authoritarian regimes, offering a model of control that sidesteps both democracy and Marxism. The result is chaos. No single ideology sweeps the board. Every proxy war is shifting contests, alliances changing with the seasons. The outcome is never certain. Speculation swirls around the Confederate nuclear question. The doctrine of mutuality assured destruction, so grimly effective between two superpowers, becomes far less stable when a third actor enters the equation. If the CSA had survived into the nuclear age, it might have sought a limited deterrent, creating a tripolar standoff, but a full nuclear arsenal seems unlikely given its smaller industrial base. Now, some alternate theorists imagine the South racing for its own bomb, a scenario that would render global deterrence far more fragile. Even the possibility of a Confederate warhead changes the calculations in every capital. Every crisis, Cuba, Berlin, the Middle East, now has a third set of red lines, a third leader with their own vision of what it's worth risking everything to protect. The world's nerves are stretched thinner, the potential for miscalculation higher than ever. Inside the United States, the presence of a Confederacy is a constant living provocation. The civil rights movement unfolds with a hostile neighbor just across the border, a state whose very existence is rebuke to the idea of American progress. Every march, every sit-in, every speech in Washington is amplified by the contrast. The CSA offers quiet support to segregationists, funds sympathetic politicians, and broadcasts propaganda designed to undermine the legitimacy of the civil rights struggle. The Soviets seized the opportunity, pointing to both the CSA and American racial injustice as proof that the West's promises are hollow. At the United Nations, the debate is relentless. How can America claim to lead the free world when apartheid flourishes next door and the color line still divides its own cities? The struggle for influence doesn't stop at borders. American and Confederate spies have moved through the same European capitals, the same African ports, the same bustling streets of Asia and South America. Soviet agents exploit the tension, playing north against south, sometimes supporting liberation movements, sometimes backing regimes that promise to keep the communists out. The world's map of alliances is redrawn every few years. Every coup and revolution, a potential shift in the rebalance. The three-player game is never fair and never still. The economic battle is just as fierce. The USA touts free markets, innovation, and the promise of upward mobility. The CSA counters with agricultural trade, low tariffs, and the lure of order for elites. Threatened by social upheaval, the Soviet Union offers a third path: central planning, state investment, ideological solidarity. Developing nations become the arena for this competition. Their leaders courted pressure, sometimes overthrown. Trade wars flare, embargoes are imposed, and black markets thrive in the spaces where officials' policies can't keep up. Culture becomes a battleground. The United States projects its music, movies, and technology across the globe, but its image is tarnished by the reality of its divided continent. The CSA promotes its own vision, rooted in tradition, hierarchy, and exclusion, offering an alternate to both Western modernity and communist revolution. The Soviets amplify every American failure, every Confederate atrocity, weaving them into a narrative of Western hypocrisy. The world's artists, writers, and intellects are pulled in every direction, their work shaped by the constant tension, the need to choose sides or carve out a dangerous middle ground. The presence of a third power destabilizes everything. The old logic of the Cold War, two superpowers locked in a balance of terror, no longer applies. Every diplomatic crisis is a three-way standoff, every arms negotiation a contest of shifting priorities and hidden agendas. The possibility of accidental war, of a single misstep triggering a cascade of catastrophe, grows with every year. The world is more connected, but also more brittle. The sense of living on the edge of history, waiting for one wrong move, never fades. And yet, for all its instability, this world is marked by a strange, relentless tension. No side can win outright. Every victory is partial, every defeat temporary. The three-player game ensures that the struggle never ends. Only changes shape, moves to a new front, finds a new battleground. The Cold War, once a grim duo, has become a disordinate trio, each note sharper and more uncertain than the last. Somewhere in the photo, from a tense summit, three leaders sit around a table. Their faces are set, their eyes wary. There is no handshake, no real trust, just the knowledge that the world they inhabit is a result of choices made long ago, and that the cost of those choices is paid every day. We don't live in that world, but its shadow lingers close enough to touch. Shift the lens to the present. Echoes of the lost, peace never signed, but always possible, still hum beneath the surface of our world. Imagine the subtle daily reminders of a history that forked in 1865 and never found its way back. The alternate timeline is not a world of grand gestures, but of small, persistent differences, each one a quiet signal that the past never truly lets go. Picture a morning in a city that feels familiar but isn't. The skyline is dotted with both Union and Confederate flags, one on a government building, the other on a bank's glass tower. A commuter checks her phone. The headlines split across rival networks, USN, the United States News, and CBC, the Confederate Broadcasting Corporation. Each tells the news with its own slant, its own priorities. A new electric car slides past, but the badge reads Richmond Motors, not Tesla. The world is connected, but the cracks show everywhere. A flight from New York to Atlanta demands a passport and a custom scan. The internet is a patchwork of firewall networks and national domains. Even the weather app has to ask which country you're in before it loads the forecast. The differences don't shout, they whisper. A family road trip means border checks at the Potomac, a new set of rules and roadside billboards as you cross into the South. The food changes, the radio stations fade, the money in your wallet is suddenly the wrong color. The background noise of life is a constant reminder. Unity was an option, not a guarantee. But the deepest fracture runs through the question of freedom. Would slavery have survived into the 21st century? Not in its old form. By the dawn of the Industrial Age, the economies of chattel slavery would have collapsed under the weight of machines and global markets. But the Confederacy's foundation was never just economics, it was ideology. The end of formal slavery would not mean the arrival of true equality. Instead, the system would mutate, adapting to new technologies and new fears. Imagine a society where the law codifies hierarchy, where surveillance enforces separation, where every advance in technology is repurposed to maintain the old world order. The world would not see abolition, but a new, more insidious kind of apartheid, one with sharper teeth, longer reach, and the cold efficiency of a century's worth of practice. International pressure would mount, but the South would dig in. Treaties and embargoes would come and go. The Confederacy would respond by doubling down on self-sufficiency and by seeking out allies who value trade over principle. Foreign corporations might invest, but always with an eye on the fine print. Labor laws, movement restrictions, and the ever-present threat of diplomatic incident. The United States, meanwhile, would find itself in a moral bind, forced to confront the daily reality of a neighboring regime built on exclusion but unable to force change without risking war. Its leaders would speak in the soaring language of freedom, but the world would hear the hollow echo, condemnation without consequence. The American identity itself would be smaller, more defensive. Without the momentum of a victorious, unified nation, the United States would be cautious, perhaps even isolationist. It would police its borders, guard its industries, and measure every foreign policy move against the risk of Southern retaliation. The research points to a country much less able to impose its moral vision on others. The rhetoric might be lofty, but the reach would be short. The world's great causes, democracy, human rights, open markets, would have one less champion, and perhaps a weaker one at that. The knock-on effects would ripple far beyond politics. The economic miracle of post-war America, the engine that powered the 20th century, would sputter without a vast, unified market. The confidence that comes from victory innovation would slow. The tech boom might have a look very different, shaped by the needs of border security and international control, rather than by the dream of a connected globe. Silicon Valley, if it existed at all, would be one of many regional hubs, each hemmed in by national priorities and wary of foreign eyes. The internet, instead of a borderless frontier, would fracture into competing networks, each shaped by the anxieties of its own government. Culture, too, would split along the old fault lines. The shared musical heritage that crossed regional lines could have fractured, leading to distinct northern and southern styles rather than a unified American sound. The blues, jazz, and rock and roll art forms, all born from the collision of pain and hope, migration and reinvention, might never have become the world's soundtrack. Instead, the North and South would cultivate separate traditions, each shaped by its own struggles, its own silences. The Great Migration, which carried the music of the South to the cities of the North, might never have happened. The result, a world where the American voice is divided, its influence diluted, its story told in competing dialects. The global consequences would be profound. The idea of America as a symbol, however flawed, a possibility and renewal would fracture. The United States would still exist, but as a diminished power, forever negotiating with its hostile neighbor, forever explaining its compromises to the world. Its condemnations of tyranny would ring hollow while an authoritarian regime thrived just across the border. The Confederacy, for its part, would become a cautionary tale that never ends, a reminder that history's darkest chapters don't always close, they just change shape. The economic balance of the world would shift. Without the stabilizing force of a booming, unified United States, the global system would wobble. The British and French empires might have lasted longer, their influence propped up by a divided continent. The Great Depression of the 1880s could have spiraled into a final crisis as the absence of American growth left Europe's capitalist order exposed. World wars might have come sooner, their causes more tangled, their outcomes even less certain. The great game of European powers would find a new arena in North America, with both the Union and the Confederacy pulled into alliances and rivalries not of their own making. And yet, the most unsettling echo is not in the headlines or the history books. It's in the small daily choices, the things we take for granted. The ease of travel, the sound of a song on the radio, the flag on a child's backpack. In this alternate present, everything is a negotiation. Nothing is assumed. Every step forward is shadowed by the knowledge that the ground beneath you could shift at any moment. We look at the flag, 50 stars, 13 stripes, waving in the afternoon sun. It's ordinary, almost invisible, until you imagine what could have been. The wholeness of it is not just a symbol, but a choice made and remade across generations. What single choice unites us with that flag today? That's the story we inherited. Sometimes the cost of peace is far higher than the cost of war. The quietest what-ifs in history are often the ones that echo the loudest, reminding us that the world we have is not guaranteed. It was fought for, and it must be remembered. History is a mirror, sometimes clear, sometimes fogged with the breath of what almost happened. The story of a peace that split America in two isn't just a cautionary tale, it's a reminder that every turning point leaves behind a world of shadows, alternate visions of ourselves. Churchill once said, "History is written by the victors," reflecting on how the stories we accept are shaped by those who survive to tell them. This alternate timeline forces us to question which truths endure and which are lost to silence. And if you want more alternate histories that challenge what we take for granted, subscribe and let us know which turning point fascinates you the most. Your theories might be the next story we explore.